do that. You heard that, didn't you? Okay, so smile, you're on candid camera. You're on the wave cam. I want to start tonight by just introducing the topic. We're looking at Jesus the teacher. And I want to look at 4 or 5 major categories of Jesus as teacher. One is that that the word rabbi in Hebrew, is usually translated in our Greek Gospels didaskalos, and you even get this in those parenthetical remarks. And they said to him, Rabbi, which means teacher, right? So functionally, that's the fact that he is functioning as a rabbi means that part of that definition is that he's got to be a teacher of disciples. So we're going to look at several different ways that the things that Jesus uses as a teacher, as a rabbi. One is hypertexting, or at least what I call hypertexting, and that is only referring to a bit or a piece of scripture to then intend that the whole be understood by the people that he's communicating with. Sometimes it's a whole verse that is intended to represent the entire chapter. Sometimes it's just a word or two that's supposed to represent the whole verse or complex of verses. So we want to talk about hypertexting. We also want to talk about some of the major topics that were up for discussion or disputation during Jesus' teaching ministry. Another topic that I want to discuss is Jesus' use of visual aids and his kind of natural points of reference. And then I'd like to conclude whatever time that we have left in a discussion of Jesus as parable maker, a teacher that regularly used parable as a means of communication. So I'm going to go now to share screen, and we'll keep on going. Share screen, my neighbor. Yeah, here we go. All right. First thing is that is a little PSA, and that goes back to Jesus and his times as the course that's going to be offered in the summer of 2022, not this summer, but next summer. And this is a course on site in the land of Israel from the 4th of July until the 17th of July. And I will be the teacher for the bus for this particular group of people that are taking this course. So we would just be continuing our study started here, but this time doing it in full context, 365, with all the smells, bells, and yells, and Jesus totally in his cultural / historical geographical context. Let me encourage you to make note of a couple of things. One is that this course starts on the 4th. Actually, it would be the next day because I think you'd be traveling on the 4th, but you would be out of the country for the 4th of July. The second thing is that you need to be aware that the really hot, dry season in the land of Israel starts in more or less late May. So by the time you get to the middle of July, it is doing a pretty good job of cooking. I was in the shade at Tel Lachish the first week of June, and it was 107 in the shade. Now, I don't want to discourage people, but I do want you to be realistic in terms of how you're able to tolerate heat and how good your stamina is, how good you do at self-policing and taking care of liquid intake, so that we're able to successfully battle the demon of dehydration, which is a real issue in the land at this time of year. So keep all of those dynamics in mind, and then if you decide that you want to spend a little time walking where Jesus and David and Abraham and Paul and others walked, well, then more power to you, and I'll see you there. It should be a whole lot of fun. All right. In terms of this business of hypertexting, or referring to a very small piece of scripture in order to get the hearer, the participant in Jesus' instruction, to think more broadly, and with this incredible memory that we have seen in past sessions in play, that the audience is then able to literally, quote, go there with Jesus, and to think in terms of bigger literary blocks of material instead of just that word or two, or even a whole verse that Jesus gives. I thought we would start with this woman caught in adultery, because it gives us a couple of opportunities to do exactly that, to catch Jesus hypertexting. I don't think that this is something that you read or watched as a video, right? Use spacebar.
We read.
You read it already? All right, then let's just, if you read it already, then let's do this in review mode. That'll give us an opportunity to cover even more ground. So Jesus goes into the temple at the beginning of John chapter 8. It says all the people were coming to him, and he sat down and began to teach. I think that maybe I mentioned to you guys last week that Jesus typically teaches seated. So he does that from a boat in Luke chapter 5. He sits down on a mountain, calls everybody to him to give the Sermon on the Mount. And did I say Luke 5? A boat in Luke 5, and on a mountain in Matthew 5. And that's the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. He sat down and opened up his mouth and began to teach them, saying, Jesus will talk about the scribes and the Pharisees. They sit on the seat of Moses. Here we see Jesus doing this very thing. He sat down and began to teach them. So he's in the temple. That's really, context is so important. Location is important. In verse 3 of John 8, it says, the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery, and having set her in the midst. We call this the passage of the woman caught in adultery. What's interesting is that she's never convicted of adultery. No one ever gives effective testimony to establish that as fact. So in a way, we've kind of almost unintentionally aligned with the scribes and Pharisees, who claimed that they had caught her in adultery, when in reality, as it all shakes out, they are not able to bring effective witness to establish that as reality. So a little background in terms of rabbinic literature. The early rabbis tell us that women who were adulterous women were to be taken before the great Sanhedrin of 71, and that is in the temple court in Jesus' day. They met in a place called the Mirkaz HaGazit, or the Chamber of Hewn Stone, and this was on the Temple Mount and somewhere located inside of or around the royal stoa, or the place of shops that covered sort of terracotta roofed building on the southern end of the Temple Mount. If you have that in your mind, you've seen the model, you've seen pictures of the model and the like. So that's evidently, it's in that general area that this must be taking place. Here's a picture of it, and if you can see my pointer, here's the royal stoa, or the Beit HaChanuyot, the place of shops, where the buying, selling, and money changing took place, where that Mirkaz HaGazit, or the Chamber of Hewn Stone, was located. They said to Jesus, and this is still in John 8, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in adultery in the very act. Now, in the law of Moses commanded us to stone such women. What then do you say?" They're trying to get Jesus to tip his hand that he is hedging on the Torah, that some kind of way he's going to be motivated by other factors that will then bring him into conflict with the law of Moses. So what do you say? They were saying this to test him, to have grounds for accusing him that he wasn't supporting or keeping up with the law of Moses. Um, uh, I'm going to skip a little stuff here. And so it says, but Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground or the earth, the dirt, you could even translate it, ground, earth, dirt. The Greek word gay, like the earth goddess Gaia. Think any of those are translational possibilities. So you probably, if you're like me, have sat in enough Sunday school lessons or listened to enough sermons where you hear a number of options being floated, that Jesus is possibly writing down the sins of her accusers, or that he's writing down the name of the woman's partner, or that he's writing down the names of people in the crowd who are guilty of the same crime and sin, or that this is my favorite, that he's stalling for time trying to come up with a good answer. None of these are probably correct. Jesus is constantly either acting or speaking in ways that hearken his listeners' attention back to the Hebrew Bible. So this verse in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 13, has this phrase, the hope of Israel is Yahweh, and all who leave you, they will be embarrassed or put to shame, and all of those who depart from you in the earth, let them be written, because they have forsaken the fountain of living waters, that is Yahweh. Here's a quick translation that I've taken from a bunch of different English translations. So let they that depart from me, they will be written in or on the earth. So more than likely, this is the only place where you have writing and writing on the ground. You've got it in John 8 and you've got it in Jeremiah 17. So it's not really difficult lifting to put those two together. But watch what happens when we start looking more broadly at context. Jesus had already described himself right before this, at the end of the previous chapter, as the fountain of living water. So that connects up with this, this Makor Maim Chaim that is mentioned, this fountain of living water that's mentioned by the prophet Jeremiah. They've forsaken the fountain of living water. Also, in the same chapter in Jeremiah, he was in the temple and he was rebuking the spiritual leadership of his day because they had committed both spiritual adultery as well as literal adultery by being engaged in fertility worship, at the same time claiming to be full followers of Yahweh and Yahweh alone. So by writing in the dirt, Jesus is evidently drawing attention to this passage in John 17, and by doing this almost like a prophetic act, the writing in the dirt, he's aligning with Jeremiah. He's connecting that text, that Ba'aretz Yikatevu, this in the ground or in the dirt may they be written. But he's also incorporating things like, and in the same way that the prophet Jeremiah, who was being rejected by the spiritual leadership in the temple, so you're doing the same thing. You're treating me the same way. He's basically telling these religious leaders that the same disobedience and rejection that was being experienced by Jeremiah in his day, that's going on in Jesus' day and will be their undoing as well. So it's an absolutely powerful figure. It's an incredible way of communicating. And having worked in the writings of the rabbis for over 40 years now, I've never seen anybody do it quite as well as Jesus does it. He just is so spot on and so subtle at the same time that every time that I discover one of these situations like we're discussing now, it scares me to death because I've been at this for 40 plus years, and I'm thinking, okay, I just saw that, and I've been reading this passage for, ever since 1974 when I came to the Lord. So what else am I missing? That's I guess my founded or unfounded. That's my worry. Anyway, we'll continue to press on and see what more damage we can do before we're done with this. So now Jesus has got their attention. He's got them thinking. The gears are turning. The skids are greased, and they're thinking through this, Jeremiah chapter 17. And before they can probably even do all of the math, Jesus says, so let him who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. And so what we get after this, I mean, when we read this, it seems to fit really well with our very permissive society. Like, well, who's to judge? And isn't everybody doing it? And after all, nobody's perfect. But we should be looking for Jesus' point of reference. When we read this, let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. The first thing in the methodology that I have developed is, okay, who did something like this here before, or who said something like this before? So I'm going to suggest to you that this be the first to goes back to Moses' own rules for determining guilt and innocence. And so the only place where you get that, again, this one time only in the whole Bible is Deuteronomy 17, where this shows up. And it's the hand of the witnesses will be the first against him to put him to death, the first two, and afterward the hand of all of the people. So I would suggest that when Jesus uses that language, and he does it on purpose, he could have said this 100 other different ways in English, in Greek, in Hebrew, and Swahili, but he says this, be the first to cast a stone. And I think he's pointing to Deuteronomy 17. And what he's doing is the hand of the witnesses. So now that we've got to factor into this discussion, okay, he's talking about witnesses. Evidently, then he's calling forward the witnesses. It's by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses that every matter is confirmed. That's in the same passage, Deuteronomy 17, and it's repeated again in chapter 19 of Deuteronomy. So quite the opposite of rejecting the law of Moses in favor of some kind of, like greasy grace or sloppe agape. Instead, he's requiring that these people who have laid a legal charge based in the law of Moses against this woman, he's requiring that they follow entirely the law of Moses before any legitimate sentence can be passed. So what he's done is he's requiring that if the people who are the first to put their hand against them are the witnesses, the first thing that he's going to do when these 2 people or possibly 3 people step forward is hold that rock just a moment. I have some questions I need to ask you. Oh, really? Well, what are those questions? Well, I'm not going to ask them here. I'm going to ask you to go to this end of the Temple Mount, and I'm going to ask you to go to the other end of the Temple Mount, and I am going to depose you separately. So you separate the witnesses, you depose them one by one, and then you carefully compare every detail of these testimonies. And if there's some substantive difference between the testimonies, those witnesses are declared to be false witnesses, and then something even more drastic happens. So this is my point here is, if you read Susanna 48 through 59 and the Mishnah, rabbinic stuff, Susanna's between the testaments is about 100 BC. Mishnah Sanhedrin is early rabbis. Then you come across some really interesting information that I think the whole audience would have known. So in Sanhedrin, you ask these questions: on what day, in what hour, in what place? If somebody says, I don't know, then his testimony is annulled. Whether during inquiries or examinations, when the witnesses contradict one another, their testimonies are nullified. Okay, so this text from 100 BC, this is, you know, a whole century before Jesus comes along. There's this story. It's a part of the apocryphal Daniel cycle that you get like in the Septuagint and just as a standalone text. Daniel comes on the scene. There's a woman who's been accused of adultery, claiming by the religious leaders that they had actually caught her in the act. And Daniel comes on the scene and he says, notice the parallels here. He says, have you condemned a daughter of Israel without examination and without learning the facts? Return to the place of judgment, for these men have borne false witness against her. Now watch how the story unfolds. Daniel said, separate them far from each other and I'll examine them. And after he examines them, finds them to be false witnesses, then we jump down to verse 61. They rose against the two elders, for out of their own mouths Daniel had convicted them of bearing false witness. And they did, the people, the crowd, did to them, meaning the false witnesses, as they had wickedly planned to do to their sister, Susanna. Acting in accordance with the, listen to this, law of Moses, they put them to death. So this is what's going to happen. These people who are wanting to execute this woman, if they're found to be false witnesses, if their witness contradicts, and their witness was going to be used to convict someone of a capital crime, they have to bear the penalty of the accused. Take a look at Deuteronomy 19. If the witness is a false witness and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had intended to do to his brother. They undergo the same penalty. Thus you shall purge evil from among you. All right. So a complex of passages establishing this. This is not just Deuteronomic law. It's not just Moses hundreds and hundreds of years before the time of Jesus. The rabbis taught this. All false witnesses suffer first that same death penalty for which the accused had been made liable. Another rabbinic text, all perjurers and illicit lovers go and suffer the form of death which they had brought on their victim. Under what circumstance? The same mode of execution. When scripture says, this is rabbis as well, you shall do to him, the false witness, as he schemed to do to his brother, it requires the form of the death penalty that is imposed on his brother. Josephus puts this in first century language. He said, anyone who has borne false witness, let him, when he is convicted, suffer the penalty which would have been incurred by him against whom he has borne false witness. First century source, writing at the same time the New Testament is being written. In fact, probably writing about the same time that John is writing the Gospel of John, around AD 90. Philo, another first century Jew and a contemporary of Jesus, says, punishment is inflicted on perjured persons. For the man who despises such important matters can't complain if he's despised in his turn, receiving a fate equal to his actions. But the punishments that are inflicted by men are of various characters, being death or scourging, and scourging is a punishment not inferior in terror to death. So back to the Susanna passage, first century, beginning of the first century BC. And so there you have another text from the intertestamental period telling us that this law of Moses, that the perjurer or that the perjured witness will suffer the same penalty as the accused. That is, that's what's being established here. By the way, it's the reason why Judas went out and hanged himself, because it's in accordance with it's in accordance with what the way that Jews spoke of crucifixion as talah, tav lamed ayin, to hang. Cursed is he who hangs on a tree, etc. So then we have another text. We've got the Dead Sea Scrolls that weigh in here. 11Q Temple Scroll. If a false witness should stand up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, the judges investigate, and if they're found to be a false witness who accused his brother falsely, deal with him as he intended to deal with his brother, life for life. So this is all over the place and really is not really difficult lifting. So basically what Jesus has done here is turn the tables on the accusers. And he said, if you want to invoke the law of Moses, then we're going to do it all the way, everything by the book. So bring forward the witnesses and let's start the official trial. So then the witnesses, it's not just like they get a free pass. You know, we can take our shots, but we don't have to, you know, dance to the same music that we play. Rather, if the witnesses are found to be false witnesses and they're accusing someone of a capital crime, they are the ones who end up being stoned and not the woman. Table is 180 turned. So I think we can skip the rest of this. But the point is that just in these little things, a little action like drawing in the dirt, or a little quote of a piece of a passage from Deuteronomy 17, be the first to, this is hearkening people's attention back to Bible passages that they know already by heart. And in so doing, he's keeping his hearers you know, on the edge of their seat, dialed in, paying close attention, and everybody's having to play having to play the game. So here's the text that where I wrote that up in article form, and I think we're going to go to another make the same point using another, and that was going back to this making of disciples that Jesus, that we started out with right before the session began. Let me see if I can, I have to go to stop share. All right, and then I go back to share. Let me pick up the carpenter choosing fisherman piece.
Dr. Nunnally, can I ask a quick question about that?
Yeah, let's do questions while we're in between.
So really, really good stuff there. What, quickly and in brief, what would be your response to the textual argument that that passage is dubious in the manuscript tradition?
There's actually a guy, when I put this out on YouTube, somebody fired off, I think from his mother's basement, a two-part series response, and made a complaint that, you know, I was going extra canonical and that this wasn't in the best manuscripts and this, that, and the other. The reality of it is, though, that most of Christendom has historically accepted this as being a genuine pericope or passage that talks about that preserves a real event in the life of Jesus. The textual problem seems to be, where in the Gospel of John is this supposed to be located? And in fact, some of the textual witnesses even suggest that it should be in the Gospel of Luke, because some of the ancient copies of the Greek New Testament situate this passage within the Gospel of Luke. Pretty much anybody that's anybody, whether it's the reformers, Calvin and Luther, or it's Raymond E. Brown more recently, who wrote, you know, the kind of one of the main authoritative commentaries on the Gospel of John, they say that this text preserves an original event in the life of Jesus. So as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really even matter whether it was in Luke or it was somewhere else in the Gospel of John or whatever. It's original Jesus stuff. And if you even want to go to the extent of saying, yeah, but because the textual witnesses are confused on this, well, then you could even dismiss it from the Bible, but you would then still have to deal with it as historical matter related to Jesus, like a Josephus text. So all of the authorities are pretty much convinced that this material is original Jesus material. So whether it is a historical recollection, or whether it is gospel, or whether it is in or not in the right place or whatever, we still have to deal with it. And when you start looking at it, it seems to have Johannine terminology. It seems to fit really well in with what was going on at the end of chapter 7, And it actually, I think, folds pretty well into, there's a good transition at the end of this passage, right on into the stuff that comes after it in John chapter 8. So I'm just trying to deal with it straight up. And is this legitimate Jesus stuff? By all measures, my conclusion is yes. And then that just leaves us to deal with, okay, well, what does it tell us about Jesus? And what you see in this is the same kind of hypertexting, or kind of sort of like an ancient footnoting system, where you just give part of the reference, and everybody else can go to the place, either mentally or with a written text, where that is Jesus' point of reference. So that's my response. Did you want to follow up?
No, that's good stuff. I mean, in a similar vein, I've always felt that it has all the hallmarks of authenticity, so much so that, the early writers were determined to get it somewhere in the text, regardless of where it ended up. And so I was just, it was good to hear a good kind of thorough response. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I hope it helps. And yeah, so I don't know. I thought about responding to the guy that made the complaint on YouTube, and then I decided, no, just the more attention that I give it, the longer life it's going to have. So I just kind of let it go. Anyway, let me do another share screen, new share. And I want to go to this article about the carpenter choosing fishermen for his disciples. Again, we were talking about this when we in the kind of warm-up session right before class started. So I was standing at Kibbutz Almagor, or Moshav Almagor, that overlooks the plain of Bethsaida, where the northern Jordan River flows into the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee, and the location where Tel El Araj is being excavated now, which is evidently the actual site of biblical Bethsaida. And there you can also look over your other shoulder, to your right shoulder, and you can see the area of Capernaum. And so it's about a 3.5 or so mile difference between where Capernaum and where Bethsaida are. Jesus' base of operations is at Capernaum, and he has a number of people who either came from Bethsaida or were even living there still at the time that Jesus met them. So we're told in the Gospels that Peter and Andrew were originally from Bethsaida, but when Jesus met up with them, they were living at Capernaum. And living in the home of Peter. Jesus then, at this idea, this question came to my mind. If Jesus is a carpenter, and everybody's all over that, that's not even questioned to any degree that I'm aware of, then why wouldn't he pick people like himself, other carpenters? Because that way, they have things in common, and they'd all be speaking the same language, same points of reference. Or why didn't he pick maybe farmers? Because there are more farmers in the land of Israel than there are fishermen. Why pick fishermen? And when he does, why does he do it in the way that he does it? He uses the strange language, I'll make you fishers of men, or you will be catching men, which isn't used anywhere else in the New Testament. It's just, it's pregnant with possibilities. So take a look at, just to get on, get on board with the physical context, the geographical context. This is a picture from looking from south to north of the land of Israel. This is a satellite image. You can see Mount Hermon up here at the very top. Down here, you can see the northern edge of the Dead Sea. The Sea of Galilee is in between, and you have this upper Jordan Valley and lower Jordan Valley connecting it all together. You can also see down at the bottom, Jerusalem, that has the letter I there. And then here's where Jesus grew up on the Nazareth Ridge, right about here. So this is big picture. We're going to start looking at Jesus' movement from Nazareth to get down onto the way of the sea and connect with as many people as possible in this direction, kind of a northeasterly movement in the general direction of Damascus. A tighter in shot, and this is the Nazareth Ridge here. This is the Jezreel Valley, kind of a spear-shaped valley, or Valley of Armageddon, some would call it. And the flow of Jesus movement would be off the backside of Nazareth Ridge, and then past the Horns of Hattin right here, and through the Arbel Pass right there that's in the dark, the shadow, out onto the plain of Gennesaret, where Magdala is situated right here, and then on over to Capernaum, which is right there. Bethsaida is right over here in the plain of Bethsaida. So again, to dial in just even tighter, Nazareth Ridge, past the Horns of Hattin, through the Arbel Pass, out onto the plain of Gennesaret. All of this is the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. His goal is to eventually get to Capernaum. And then Bethsaida is here. Looking at it obliquely, here's Nazareth, coming off the backside, going through the extension of the Beit Natofa Valley. Here's the Horns of Hattin, and then the Arbel Pass. Same stuff we talked about earlier. Now here's an aerial photograph showing the same thing. Beautiful wheat fields in various stages of ripening, and the Arbel Pass, and then the plain of Gennesaret out here adjacent to the sea. Magdala is on the backside of this, is called Mount Arbel. And so if you could see through that, if you could look right at my pointer and get right to the edge of the Sea of Galilee on the other side, you would be at Magdala. Here's an aerial of Capernaum. This is the location before the modern spaceship-looking church was built. And after the excavation had produced this basilica, or this Byzantine kind of an octagonal or stop sign shaped church. Here's the synagogue right here. You can see the insula dwellings that are around the edges. This is the way that you walk in from where the bus is parked and through the gate into the complex. Areas for prayer in the trees and all along the seashore over here. Really beautiful location that we spend a considerable amount of time on when we're in the land of Israel. It's the Roman Catholic Church of St. Peter is here, and this is the Greek Orthodox Church of the Apostles over here outside of the wall that is marks the edge of the property owned by the Roman Catholic Church. Some excavation has been done, as you can see by these pits. Here is the plain of Bethsaida, and this is the lower Jordan River flowing into the Sea of Galilee over about right here. Here's a close-up of it. All the way over here at this little white dot right on the sea's edge, that's Capernaum. So we're looking back toward Capernaum now from Bethsaida. And so Jesus is at Capernaum, and he says, "Follow me and I'll make you fishers of men." Very interesting turn of the phrase, right? Did that just occur to him on the spot because he happened to see a bunch of people fishing? And Luke's version of it is even more interesting. "Don't fear, from now on, you will be catching men." So thinking about Jesus' ministry on earth, we hear this in the Gospel of John, that he did, keep this in the back of your mind as we're looking at other texts, that God didn't send his son primarily at the first time to judge the world, but that the world should be saved through him. So Jesus' mission here is a mission not of judgment, but rather of rescue. And so to ask the obvious question, where does this language of fishing for men come from? Well, you look at Jesus' Bible, keep your eye in the rearview mirror. Who said something like this before? Who did something like this here before? Those kinds of rearview mirror questions that are going to drive you back into Jesus's Bible or Paul's Bible or whoever happens to be speaking or writing. And Ezekiel 29, we only have two passages that are possible. Ezekiel 29 says, speak and say, thus says the Lord God, behold, I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So automatically, we're almost going to rule this out because it's not addressing the people of Israel. It's addressing a pagan ruler of a pagan nation. The great monster that lies in the midst of his rivers that has said, my Nile is mine and I myself have made it. I will put hooks in your jaws. I will make the fish of your rivers cling to your scales, and I will bring you up out of the midst of your rivers, and all of the fish of your rivers will cling to your scales. It just doesn't sound like the same kind of purpose or context, the intent of Jesus' language. This is basically God's going to bring judgment on Pharaoh, not God. God is going to bring blessing to the people of Israel. We do have a text from roughly the time of Jesus. This is a Dead Sea text from the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's the Thanksgiving hymns, and the author picks up on that Ezekiel 29 passage. You made my lodging with many fishermen, those who spread the net upon the surface of the sea, those who go hunting the sons of iniquity, and there you established for me the judgment. That's exactly the attitude of the Qumran community, is that God is going to use them, the sons of light, as an instrument of judgment against the sons of darkness, and they will be used to institute God's judgment on a wicked, unbelieving, disobedient world. There's another passage, though, not in Ezekiel, but rather in, again, the same book that Jesus appealed to in his writing on the earth, in John chapter 8. It's this Jeremiah the prophet. Jeremiah in chapter 16 says, behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when it will no longer be said, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the sons of Israel out of the land of Egypt, but rather, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of the north and from all the countries where he banished them. So this sounds more restoration. This sounds more rescue. So the context is moving in more the correct direction. For I will restore them, restoration. I'll restore them to their own land, which I gave to their fathers. And then Jeremiah continues, behold, I'm going to send for many fishermen. And there it is, declares Yahweh, and they will fish for them. I believe that this is likely the place that Jesus is accessing. He's hearkening his hearers back to. He's signaling to everybody that he and his disciples have a chance to impact, whether it's by the way they talk or their terminology, the way they dress. I would say maybe by the way they smell, but hopefully not. But there's something that identifies these people as fishermen, not as carpenters, not as shoemakers, not as farmers, but as fishermen. And if that's the case, and Jesus is sending out 2 by 2, as many as 70 people at a time, according to Luke, then you've got a society that's saying, hey, what's going on here? There are people who are coming to our town and they are preaching and teaching, but they're not rabbis. And they talk and they look and they smell and they act like fishermen. And we ask them where they're from, and they say, I'm from places like Capernaum. I'm from a place like Bethsaida, fishing villages, Magdala. Then what's going on here? What's this invasion of the fishermen into my village? It gets them thinking, and they start looking around for, what's the ancient text being referred to here? Because that's the game everybody's playing. And they very quickly dispense with the Ezekiel passage, and this is the only one left standing, Jeremiah 16. I suggest that maybe you take a look at, and we're going to go on to another, consider another example, but maybe take a look at that article that I wrote, why would a carpenter choose fishermen? It's out there on the internet, and I can't remember whether I asked you to read it to get ready for the class or not. Anybody want to weigh in on that or offer? Did? Okay, so I'm going to stop share. All right, so, and if you want to go back and take a look at it yet again, after we've kind of talked through a little bit of it, it may mean a little bit more to you. At least here's hoping. So I'm going to do another share screen. Actually, I think maybe we'll get rid of that for a second. Let's just talk for a second about a passage that came up last week. Last week, we were talking about poetic parallelism, and I gave you a couple of examples of where Jesus got this idea from, this literary device called Hebraic poetic parallelism or Hebrew poetic parallelism. I gave you the example of Psalm 22 and also a passage from the book of Isaiah. So we used those as kind of examples of lots and lots of material in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament being written in a way that you make the same point 3, 4, 5 different times, just using different vocabulary sets each run that you make at making that point, right? Do you remember Psalm 22? It starts out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And I suggested to you that you take a look at an article that I wrote a long time ago. Did God abandon Jesus on the cross? Reason being, we hear a lot of preaching and teaching about that. God can't look on sin. He'd taken on the sins of the whole world upon himself. And because of that, God could not look upon him, but he had to turn his face from him. It's a misappropriation or a misinterpretation of a passage in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 13. But I know that your eyes are too holy to look on sin. What Habakkuk is trying to say is, how in the world can you even use the Babylonians to judge us? They're more wicked than we are. It ends up that in Psalm 22, Jesus is actually responding to a charge that the religious leaders had made. Hey, he's on the cross and God has not delivered him. And yet Psalm 22 verse 8 says, if he delights in him, let him deliver him. If God delights in him, let him deliver him. And they're making the point that if Jesus is still on the cross, hasn't been delivered, then God evidently has turned his back on him and does not delight in him. So what we have done unintentionally, totally, I got that. But what we've done is we've yet again aligned with the religious leaders rather than aligning with Jesus. We've made the same point they were trying to make. God's abandoned him. And so if we buy into that, then what we have to conclude is, all right, well then things like, evidently God didn't accept Jesus' sacrifice. You can't turn your back on a sacrifice and accept it at the same time. Point number one. Point number two, if God didn't accept Jesus' sacrifice, then we probably should just turn the Zoom session off tonight and go home and put our kids to bed and whatever else we have to do, because we're not forgiven. We're not right in God's eyes right now. Because the sacrifice is supposed to be applied to our lives wasn't accepted. Here's another thought. Why is it that Jesus keeps talking to God? Things like, into your hands I commit my spirit. If Jesus knew that God had abandoned him, it turned his back on him. Here's another question. In the whole New Testament, whether it's Paul or it's Peter or it's, the writer of Hebrews or whoever, Jesus' sacrifice, we are told, was an acceptable offering. And it's on the basis of the blood of Jesus that we have forgiveness of sins and adoption as sons and daughters and right relationship with God, and we're in right standing in God's eyes and stuff like that. So the rest of the New Testament tells us that Jesus' sacrifice was offered and accepted. He appeared, according to Hebrews, in the very holy of holies in the heavenly tabernacle and offered to God the Father the blood of his own precious son. So those are some questions that I think should be legitimately asked before we buy into this popular teaching that God the Father turned his back on Jesus on the cross. But that then still takes us back to Psalm 22. Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in that psalm, what you get is a person in process, which is really beautiful because that's what we are. We're people in process, right? And how many times have we felt like, because of circumstances, because of persecution, because of, some really bad situation that has come upon us? Maybe it was a car wreck, or maybe we got pink slipped, or something like that. And God, where are you? It's the first thing that it's almost instinctive, that where were you when I needed you, God? And what we're told in places like Psalm 46, he's a very present help in time of trouble. Well, the psalmist is struggling to get to that point. And so he starts out his processing of what's going on. God, I am in trouble, and why have you forsaken me? A band of evildoers has encircled me. They pierced my hands and feet. And so, but then just like 10 verses later, he says, don't be far from me. Wait a minute, I thought that he'd been forsaken. Now he's saying, don't be far from me. So he's moving his attitude, his outlook, his perception of God in just 10 verses is changed from why have you forsaken me to a request, don't be very far from me, I might need you again. Finally, you get to, from the horns of the wild oxen, I think it's around verse 20, from the horns of the wild oxen, you do hear me. So now he's fully acknowledging that God hasn't abandoned him at all. God didn't leave him at all. And he's been hearing him all along. Well, how does that happen? Back earlier in the Psalm, two things have happened. He reflects back on the fact that God's past history is that God has never been unfaithful to his people. He's never forsaken them. He's always run into a burning, exploding, collapsing building rather than running away. He's always run to a fight, not away from a fight. And then the next thing that he thinks about is, and you know what? I was cast on you from my birth, and you always took care of me. So he's kind of getting a bigger picture of, historically, you've always taken care of my people. And even with me personally, you've never forsaken me before. So I guess maybe I stand corrected, God, because what I thought in the throes of my own personal difficulty, I was misreading that situation. You didn't go anywhere. And then in verse 24, we get the most beautiful statement, because you have not abandoned, you have not despised the affliction of the afflicted, nor have you hidden your face when he called out to you. So in 24 verses, the psalmist has gone full circle. Have you ever been trapped in a difficulty, in a tight situation? And your immediate response is, God, where in the world are you? Where were you when that happened? And then you process and you reflect on his goodness, and you think about how he's been faithful to you and how he's been faithful to the covenant community in hundreds and hundreds of years past. And you come back to this point, okay, so maybe I am in a difficult situation, but what I realize is that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I am Yahweh, I do not change. And God hasn't gone anywhere. And so you keep pressing back in and you realize that it wasn't God that moved, it was us. We took our eye off the ball for just a minute and we got our eyes on a difficulty, a really bad circumstance. And the promise of Scripture is constant. I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. I will never fail you. I will go with you wherever you go to bless you. I'm with you even unto the ends of the age. I will not leave you as orphans. That behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. It's just this constant barrage of promise after promise after promise that God's not going anywhere. He's got his eye on us and he's not going to take his eye off the ball even when we do. So be encouraged in that. My point in this, though, is not just to give you a cheesy little devotional, but it's when Jesus has the presence of mind on the cross to quote a passage of Scripture, and then in dialogue with these people who have already gotten way ahead and they quoted verse 8, he goes, no, go back to the beginning and read the whole thing. And that's just an amazing display of presence of mind. It's an amazing display of being able to dialogue in his community and play the game that's always played. You have to have a sacred text to play. You have to have, you got to be referencing Bible to make your point, or people go, well, you know, I don't have to listen to you. You don't get to play because you don't have text. And so the fact that he is able to do this in this dire circumstance in his own life, and bring us back to square one on a beautiful promise. It's by the way, it's the thing that connects, guys, all of the covenant renewals in the whole Bible. Every time there's a covenant renewal, you get this consistency. You get this one thing remaining consistent, the promise of God's presence. God's promising to be present with his people. Draw near to me and I'll draw near to you. Very present help in time of trouble. That's the thing that unites all of these. It's the one point of commonality that unites all of these covenants, old and new, in the entire Bible. Fascinating study. But the reason that I did it is because this is another example of Jesus hypertexting. He quotes one verse and he intends for us to know the contents of the whole psalm. And to understand, for everybody listening, hey, these guys think God has abandoned me. You know what? Everybody thought that God had, including David himself, everybody thought that God had abandoned my ancestor David, but he didn't. And he hasn't abandoned me either. Just keep watching. Keep your eye on the ball and watch what happens. God will vindicate his oppressed, his harassed, his harried people. So another example of hypertexting. I wrote an article that I don't think that you can get at because you have to have a subscription. If you have a subscription to the Jerusalem Perspective, you can get it. But it was an article on Luke chapter 23, verse 31. And there Jesus says, if they do this when the tree is green, what will they do when the tree is dry? Literally in the Greek, if they do this in the green tree, what will they do in the dry? And there's a really interesting passage in the prophecy of Ezekiel. And there's a couple of passages. One is Ezekiel chapter 17, verse 2, but the best one is Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 47. I wonder if I could get one of you guys to read that second passage, Ezekiel 21, verse 47. And you have to hold your Bible and hit the space bar at the same time. So I hope that you're ambidextrous. Oh, and by the way, you don't have to wait for the Spirit to move to read the Bible because the whole thing's already anointed. Isn't that cool?
What verse did you say?
47, 21, 47.
I only have 32 verses.
Okay. 20, 47. Maybe I wrote it down wrong. I have this treasure in earthen vessels as well. Maybe it's 20, 47.
I think it is 2047.
All right, let's go with that then.
Okay, I can read for, I
Thank
can
you.
read. Say to
Save
the
me
southern, say to the southern forest, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm about to set fire to you, and it will consume all your trees, both green and dry. The blazing flame will not be quenched, and every face from south to north will be scorched by it.
All right, so trees usually, when used metaphorically, are referring to people. And Ezekiel is not talking about that God is really into forest fires. Ezekiel is saying that God is going to bring judgment on the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, and that fire, as with John the Baptist, for the obedient and responsive, he's going to baptize with the Holy Spirit. For the rebellious and the wicked, he is going to baptize with fire. So typically fire is going to be a symbol of judgment, a metaphor for judgment. So God is going to judge people. And it says that he is going to send a fire, and it's going to consume all the trees, both the green, meaning the healthy tree, the fruitful tree, as well as the barren tree, the dried up tree, the unfruitful tree. Jesus is pulling out of Ezekiel this reference to coming judgment. And he's saying, folks, you just have no idea. If I am the righteous, and this is befalling me, think of when the evil day comes, what's going to happen to the wicked, the disobedient, the unresponsive, and the rebellious, the mutinous among us. There's going to be no hope for that tree. It will be burned up. It will be, the judgment will fall upon it in a mighty way. There are a whole bunch of other passages. There's a passage in the book of Proverbs that if it's this way with the righteous, what will it be with the wicked, and that kind of thing. And then there are a whole bunch of other passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the rabbis and that sort of thing that I bring to bear on this text. It's I didn't have you read this, did I? Did this get put on the JUC website? This Ezekiel and Luke 23. Maybe I could get Diane to do that. I can put a pre-publication version there and you could read it. Is that something that you'd be interested in? I can make a note to do that. Yeah. Send to Diane. All right. Questions or comments, especially about method? Thank you for reading that, Gloria.
I have a question that's been burning, but it's not about method. Can I ask about that comment you made about Judas earlier in passing?
Sure.
That blew me up when you said that Judas had gone out and hung himself in order to fulfill the Torah command about taking on the punishment of a false witness. And it brought to mind something I'd read in Dr. Young's book, Meet the Rabbis, where he compared the story about Judas with one of the rabbis who had a disciple that betrayed him in a similar fashion, and
Right.
considered repentance. It actually was considered repentance. And I wonder if we've gotten that story of Judas wrong, and that when Judas goes out and does that, he's enacting repentance, as Dr. Young was talking about in the book there.
Well, in Matthew 27, it says in the text that he repented. Not only that, but it says that he brought back the 30 pieces of silver, meaning that he, quote, made restitution. And so that's going on in our Bible without any help from outside. What what I think is going on is this whole idea of the false witness, but also there's another classification of people in Jesus' day called the Mosar or the Moser. It's a Hebrew word that means the betrayer. So a betrayer is basically functionally is functioning like a false witness. He's turning someone over of his own people for execution. And so, according to the rabbis of that day, people who did this, they find their place in the lake of fire with no hope of redemption, no hope. There isn't any sacrifice that's prescribed or anything. The rabbis hold out only one possibility for redemption for these kinds of that people that find themselves in this situation, and that is if they repent at the same time that they die the same death as the person that they turn over. I have an article on this that I'm working on for publication right now. I think it's IVP that is supposed to first publish it. Jerusalem Perspective is supposed to publish it as well digitally. But did I put that on as a study, The Death of Judas?
No, I didn't see it. That is amazing. No,
I probably thought I was going to get in trouble if I did that. Because as soon as you start suggesting this, I've presented this academically, and even academics say, so you're saying that Judas actually made it to heaven? I'm saying no, Judas thought he was going to make it to heaven. I don't know whether he's made it or not. I can text you when I get there, but other than that, who knows, you know? I'm not the judge of all the earth. But then the other thing that people complain about, so are you saying that suicide is okay? No, I'm not even talking about that. What I'm talking about was, what was Judas' motive? Why did he come back and confess? Why did he to the priests? I've sinned in betraying innocent blood. And then why does he repent? And why does he make restitution? And then why does he go out and kill himself? We've made up all kinds of make-believe things like, well, he was, you know, he was disappointed that Jesus' ministry didn't go the way he wanted it to. He was despondent. He was grief-stricken. He was, you know, full of this, that, and the other. All that does is put Judas on the psychologist couch and make us a psychiatrist, you know, and it's all make-believe because this is all a party in our own mind. We're just coming up with, we're doing kind of shotgun approach and hope something sticks, rather than sticking with the sources, sticking with the evidence. So whether I'm right or wrong, my goal was pursue the evidence. And then after you get as much evidence as you can find on the table, then you can begin to make some tentative conclusions. But it's definitely, I'm not trying to justify Judas. I'm not trying to shoo him into heaven. For all I know, he's on slow cook right now, you know? And it's not that I'm trying to justify people who have committed suicide or say suicide is okay. I'm trying to get at motive. What was motivating Judas? What was going on in his world that created this really interesting response from the priests? What is that to us? See to it yourself. You ever heard anybody deal with that? I don't hear people, I don't hear people dealing with that. So in Waves world, that's an opportunity to go off-road, you know, and to deal with what other people are not interested in pursuing. Yes, Rod.
Connect the thought at the Passover Seder where it says Satan entered him and he left. Connect all that to that for me.
I think that he was definitely under the influence of Satan, no doubt about that. I'm also, though, trying to square that with what's going on in Matthew 27. When he's repenting, that's evidently not Satan in control of him, right? Because Satan doesn't usually lead us in the way of repentance. When he's trying to make restitution, that's not usually some sort of satanic fruit either. That's somebody who's acknowledging by a physical act that something they have done has brought hurt, and they're willing to make it right in a very physical show of attempt to make things right. So I don't know, there's lots going on, and I don't think we dismiss either of those passages. I think we have to come to grips with them together, not separately, but together.
Dr. Nunnally, can I make a statement?
Yes, Cindy, go ahead.
Yes, so in John 17:12, here, I'll turn my camera on. There we go. John 17:12 says, while I was with them, I protected them and kept them safe by that name you gave me. None has been lost except the one doomed to destruction, so that scripture would be fulfilled. Who is that?
That would have to be Judas, our old friend.
I think he did not repent. I think he returned the money out of fear. I think that was more out of fear than repentance.
Okay, so I'm not sure still what you do though with the language of he confessed and said, I have sinned in betraying innocent blood. I also don't know what you do with all of this stuff, whether it's Dead Sea Scrolls or rabbis or whatever, that that talk about this person that does this is going to go to hell unless they make these number of steps. So I'm trying to factor in all the evidence here, Cindy, not just the bits and pieces that seem to be the clearest. And
Sure.
I'm hearing what you're saying from John 17. But again, trying to wrangle with all of the evidence, it looks to me like that Judas is pulling out all the stops, trying to keep from busting hell wide open, as we say in the South, or going to hell in a handbasket. And I'm not saying that he even succeeded. That's not what's in view here. I'm
Right.
not saying that he succeeded. I'm saying that he was playing the only card that he had in his culture. I'm not saying this is not even the stuff that we're dealing with in these texts that talk about here's how you regain redemption are not even biblical texts. So we're not trying to establish matter of faith and practice on the basis of stuff outside the Bible. What we're trying to do is get into Judas's head. And my comments are geared around, they're organized around ancient texts that we do have. Not maybe it could be, or somebody's personal position or opinion or whatever, theory or the like, but trying to deal with all the evidence. And I find that to be compelling as far as a methodology, but also a whole lot of fun because it pushes you to go places that you otherwise would not go, and to wrangle with texts that are both inside and outside of the canon.
Dr. Nunnally, taking that thought then, what was going on in Judas's mind according to Deuteronomy 19:19, as you suggested? What was he think he was doing?
He was putting to death the false witness. He was executing the false witness. If I'm right about this, Judas' death, we could call it whatever we wanted to. You may notice that the Bible, Old and New Testament, they don't have a word for suicide because it wasn't all that popular back then. I think we get maybe one example in all of Scripture, and that's Saul, which is more like a mercy killing because he was already wounded in battle. And he knew that he was going to be tortured to death if the Philistines caught up to him on Mount Gilboa. But anyway, I think that what Judas would have said was, if he knew what suicide was, he would say, no, it's not that. This is an execution. Maybe self-imposed execution. So then we could wrangle with, terminology. But the reality of it is that he's not despondent. He's not grief-stricken. He's not discouraged. He's not depressed. He's going to hell in his mind. What he'd been taught since he was a kid was, I just committed the unpardonable sin of Judaism. I turned over a fellow Jew to the oppressing power. And now that he's going to be executed, the only hope that I have of regaining heaven and not being on slow cook for eternity is to self-execute and to confess as I'm doing that. It's not it's
I think
Randall.
it's, yeah, I was just gonna say, I think it's interesting though, too, as we examine what's going on in Judas's heart and motives. We also should probably look at what's going on with Matthew's presentation of Judas. Because if Matthew's presenting him this way, he full well knows that this theory is circulating in the culture at that time, that this
Absolutely.
power betrayer, and Matthew is intentionally presenting him as someone who has repented. And even though he's doomed to destruction, you know, Matthew's still intentionally presenting him as someone in this vein of thought that has repented and done what was needed to be done.
Yeah, so in a backhanded kind of way, I think you're right, Randall, and take it just one step further, and that is to say that what better witness to the innocence of Jesus for people in the culture who thought, well, hey, if cursed is he who hangs on a tree, and if Jesus was crucified, then that must mean that he's a malefactor and that God was not approving of him. Well, why not trot out the best witness possible? And that is, you know what, I was in on the whole thing from the very beginning, and I was wrong, and he was innocent. And so I'm guilty and he's innocent. What better witness to trot out than Judas Iscariot to his culture? And that kind of, you know, doing it by the law of Moses, et cetera, under the teachings of the rabbis and the like, then here's prima facie evidence number one. Exhibit one, Judas walked it all back. He took it all back. And he was so serious about it that he signed it in his own blood. It's just a thought. Hey, look, Ed, I don't want to get hung up on that because it's just one more example of this matter of, you know, kind of one little tiny text can lead to a whole bunch of other text type stuff. So let's take a look at another example and we'll see, you know, what time does after that. Share screen, and I wanted to do this one. I wanted to look at Jesus. My house will be a house of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a den of thieves. Okay. And just, I want to run through this as quickly as possible, but it's a really cool thing that Jesus does here in Matthew chapter 21, verse 13. And there's the temple. And so just give you a little bit of, you know, geographical perspective. My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made you are making it into a den of robbers. So the first part of the quote is from Isaiah. The second part is from, again, I think Jesus' favorite prophet, Jeremiah. So Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 11. So this is what we get when we go back to Jesus' point of reference. And we know Jesus is referring to this because he says, you turned it into making it a den of thieves. That's Jeremiah. That's only Jeremiah. So stand in the gate of the Lord's house. Bam. Where was Jesus in Matthew 21? He was in the temple. So again, he's drawing connection between himself and the prophet because they're standing in the same location. Stand in the gate of the Lord's house, the temple, and proclaim there this word. Hear the word of the Lord of Yahweh, all of you Judah, who enter by these gates to worship Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your deeds, and I will let you dwell in this place. Don't trust in deceptive words saying, this is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. So they got their confession right, but their hearts weren't right. Verse 5, for if you truly amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly practice justice between a man and his neighbor, if you don't oppress the alien, if the orphan, the widow, don't shed innocent blood in this place or walk after other gods. In other words, if you just obey my word, then I'll let you dwell in this place and in the land that I gave your fathers forever and ever. Behold, you're trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, offer sacrifices to Baal, walk after the gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house which is called by my name and say, we are delivered, that you may do all of these abominations. That's where the passage in Jeremiah 7:11 comes, is this house which is called by my name. By the way, that's the reason why Jesus is able to connect Isaiah and Jeremiah together, this house called by my name. They're sharing similar terminology. But Jeremiah continues on, become a den of robbers in your sight. I have seen it, declares the Lord. But then, and so this is what Jesus is now channeling. He's trying to get people to think of this when he gives that little phrase real quick, Jeremiah 7:11 about den of thieves. They go back to the whole context of that passage. And the next verse is, but go to my place that was at Shiloh, where I made my name to dwell at first. For 367 years, the tabernacle sat there at Shiloh, and then it was destroyed in a conflagration, presumably by the Philistines. I made my name to dwell at first, and see what I did to it because of the wickedness of my people. So Jesus is hearkening back to, and using Jeremiah to hearken back to, hey, this has happened before. This is not just, kind of a freebie. You can do whatever you want to do. There is payday someday. And as there was for Shiloh, and as there was for the first temple, so there will, of Jeremiah's day, so there will be payback. There will be some kind of divine retribution for turning my house into a den of thieves. That's going to happen again in the generation that Jesus is speaking to. So it's in stealth mode, a prediction of the destruction of the second house or the second temple. So because of all the things that you've done, declares the Lord, etc., I'm going to do to the house which is called by my name, in which you trust, and to the place that I gave you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh. I sent my servants, the prophets. They stiffened their neck. They wouldn't listen. Psalm 78 mentions this destruction at Shiloh as well. It's not just Jeremiah. And Jeremiah mentions it twice, actually. Gave up his glory to the hand of the adversary. So I just wanted to share that passage with you again. I'll stop share, and you can discuss with me a little bit about that. I'm just suggesting to you that if we're going to understand Jesus, the teacher, that we really have got to enter into his world and not just drag him kicking and screaming into our little Sunday school home Bible study world, and really listen to his words and really pick up on some of his methods. Last week, we talked about poetic parallelism. This week, we're talking about hypertexting. It's all a part of Jesus' teaching ministry. And if we want to go to the next level of sensitivity to the scriptures, to the words of scripture, sensitivity to the teachings of Jesus, I would suggest that this is at least one way forward. You can read devotionals all you want. You can read commentaries all you want. But I think it's really helpful for us to start hearing Jesus afresh, like that first audience heard him, with the same kind of dynamics that these guys were could be assumed to have within them. This kind of vast memory of scripture, this ability to pick up on the most subtle of references, and then go back and incorporate the whole context of where Jesus was pushing us, to begin with. And in this way, we get what scholars call the sensus plenior. We get the fuller sense of what Jesus is trying to do there. And I think that in many occasions, it's the only way to really grasp what it is that he's trying to communicate. It's unfortunate that he doesn't come in the 21st century and he's not speaking English and he's not talking directly to us over a Zoom session or something like that. But it's unfortunate for us. The reality is we can't turn back the hands of time. He's lived, he's spoken, he's ministered. And it's what we have now is the help of the Spirit and the guidance of the written word of God. And after that, it's just kind of up to us how far do we want to push the envelope? How much do we want to mature in this? And how badly do we want to understand those precious few words in comparison to the whole Bible? How with those precious few words that are written in red? Does that make sense? So I hope you're hearing where I'm coming from and you hear my heart in this. And I'm not trying to grasp at straws, and I'm not picking it around the edges. I'm trying to get to the very kind of methods that Jesus used in his teaching ministry that you as somebody that's a school teacher or a stay-at-home mom or a janitor at a local high school or whatever, that you can pick up, a CPA, a lawyer, a chiropractor, or whatever, that just not a Bible nerd, not some kind of an academic ivory tower egghead, that the average person can begin to read these words with a freshness that comes practically like that would have been experienced by a first audience of Jesus. Start looking at these, things like literary devices, poetic parallelism. You can see that in English. Hypertexting, like we talked about tonight. You can see this. You just start asking yourself very simply, I'm keeping my eye on the rearview mirror. What do I see back there? What sounds like this before? What happened like this here before? And all of a sudden, all kinds of possibilities for better, clearer, sometimes deeper understanding will present themselves. And it's not some kind of a blackjack game, where most of the cards are hidden. This is not just for the person that's knows Greek and Hebrew like the back of their hand. They've been to seminary, they're ordained, blah 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 blah. It's not, the word of God is not just for that kind of person. It's to you and to your children and all who are afar off.
Dr. Nunnally,
Yes.
it's Elisa.
Hey, Elisa.
Hello. I was wondering, the class that you're going to lead next summer, that is in through JUC, will you focus on this idea of the hypertexting? Like, will we be visiting places where in Galilee and getting to learn more from you on this, and not challenge you, but discuss ideas?
When we're in Israel, it's a rolling classroom, even on the bus. And I never stop talking, and that's sad to say, but I tell people, don't wait for a pause before you grab a cat nap, or you journal or daydream or just look out the window and enjoy the scenery, because that time's never going to come. So if you get tired, if you get full, then you just tune out, put your earbuds in, turn some music on, and tune out, because that's the way we roll. So this stuff, all of this stuff, it's all going to be on the table, every bit of it. Culture, language, literature, ancient history, art, archaeology, geography. Because what I do is I take a multidisciplinary approach where I fold everything in together, so that we then, wherever we are, whatever passage we're studying, we are trying to get the full meal deal, rather than looking through the telescope backward at one little tiny piece of evidence and then trying to reconstruct reality from that.
Thank you.
It's all on. It's going to all be on the table.
So
This and everything else.
So Dr. Nunnally, I have a question about the den of thieves, the den of robbers.
Okay.
When the original audience heard that, what do you think they were thinking? Do you have some clues for us about that? And
I think that the biblically literate among them would their ears would be tingling, because they would immediately get it. They would pick up on, oh my goodness, he's channeling Jeremiah, and he's doing it in the temple, and it's right where Jeremiah said those same words, and he's hopscotching from Jeremiah all the way back to Shiloh, and he's saying that this temple that we love and where we get our living, if these Sadducees and priests and stuff, that God's going to bring this thing down to the ground in the same way that he did Solomon's temple, and in the same way that he did to his tabernacle in Shiloh. They got that, and they recognized that this was a judgment oracle. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever about that. It's the distance is so short between those 2 points, Matthew 21 and Jeremiah chapter 7, that a school kid in Jesus' day could have done that math. Everybody got it, no doubt. So good question, and thanks for helping to fine tune on that. Anything else before we get out of here? I can't believe it, but I've run my mouth for another hour and a half and wasted an hour and a half of your lives. But I wanted to talk about, for example, the 2 major things that are at issue, major topics for discussion and disputation: Sabbath observance and ritual purity. If you go to the Mishnah and you look at all the stuff about Sabbath observance and ritual purity, it's more on those 2 topics than anything else. If you go to the Tosefta, if you go to the 2 Talmuds, in other words, all of early rabbinic literature is dominated by these 2 issues. No surprise at all that it was this in Jesus' day. So what Jesus is doing is he's addressing things that are popular matters of concern, things that are burning issues. I mean, for us, Sabbath observance and ritual purity, probably not on your hit list, right? Not on your laundry list of got to check that off, got to talk about that today. That's going to be in my lesson plan. We don't talk about that at church because, you know, Sabbath observance and ritual purity, those seem to be, quote, Jewish issues. Exactly. And that's what Jesus is dealing with. He is a very relevant kind of, we're going to hit you right between the eyes every day, all day. That was Jesus' approach to this teaching ministry that we've been considering tonight. I wanted to talk about visual aids. Maybe we'll do a little bit of that next week, but next week is going to be a whole lot about Jesus' miracle working ministry, because so many scholars have spent so much time picking apart Jesus' words and they have ignored the miracle working aspect. They've ignored his personal piety and all that. And I wanted us to get a little bit more well-rounded view of this person, Jesus, because of this class than maybe you had coming in. Anyway, I look forward to seeing you next week. Give the thought of that summer session in the July of 2022 some consideration. And if you want next week, you can ask questions about that. I don't know how much more I would be able to offer. It is already on the website. You can take a look and get more information maybe there. Parable, didn't even get to it tonight. But we will try to hit a little bit of that before we get off into miracles next week. So God richly bless you. Have an awesome rest of the week. Get out there and represent him and love somebody. Not the Stephen Stills love somebody, but the Jesus, get out there and love somebody.
Dr. Nunnally?
Yes, sir.
Going back to the fishers of men of Jesus invitation.
Yeah, your guys are welcome to take off. We'll just hang around a while for those that don't want to take off.
Would Ezekiel 47 and 48 be a piece of what Jesus is offering to the disciples and the grand vision that Ezekiel paints of the water flowing out of the temple and the fishermen coming and fishing as participants in the eschatological kingdom of God? That what Jesus is offering to the disciples, be they actual fishermen or not, being participants into the kingdom that God is bringing.
Okay, so Ezekiel does talk about fishing activity in chapter 47, and I think that Ezekiel 47 does play into, I think Jesus has a very clear idea about Ezekiel 47, and he sees it as when he's talking about living water. This is the Ezekiel. By the way, Ezekiel 47 is parallel to Zechariah 14, and that's where you get that language of living water. So when he is at the Beit HaShoevah, or the Pool of Siloam, or the temple, or what the temple is where he says it, he's talking about this Ezekielian, Zechariah vision of the end of time, where this end time river opens up underneath the temple, flows to the east, and makes all the water in the Dead Sea, believe it or not, to be fresh water. What is 34% saline and mineral content is going to completely reverse. So this is, in a way, it's Ezekiel's language for what Isaiah calls the new heavens and the new earth. It is truly end time terminology. So yes, I see Jesus as reflecting some of the stuff that we get in Ezekiel 47, but not in this call to his disciples, where he talks about not just fishing, but fishing for men. The only place where you have that kind of language of fishing for human beings is in Ezekiel 29. And then this that talks about, that's that oracle against Pharaoh of Egypt. And then this passage in Jeremiah, that where God says, at the end of time, I'm going to restore my people. I'm going to call them from the north, the south, the east, and the west, and everywhere that they have been driven. And I'm going to restore my blessing, my presence, my covenant. I'm going to restore them to the land. That's restoration language. It fits Jesus' restoration movement and the tenor of the primary purpose of his ministry. And it talks about fishing for men. And that's what I am dialing in on. It's the only place other than that Ezekiel 29, which I don't, the context is wrong there. By the way, in the article that I wrote on that, I mentioned that maybe we went over it, that in 1QH, the Dead Sea community looked at that Ezekiel passage, chapter 29, as one of the primary texts that motivated them, and that they are God's instruments of destruction, of judgment, in that language of fishing. But that's not Jeremiah 7. Or Jeremiah 16. That's Ezekiel 29.
So Dr. Nunnally, I have another question. A lot of times after Jesus teaches, the response of the crowd is this the prophet? Are you the prophet? I mean, they asked John the Baptist that, but this comes out. So the prophet that they're talking about, he doesn't always answer either. So could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, I think a lot of times what Jesus does, he just sort of, instead of, giving the store away, he kind of lets people think. He gives them a little, not like me, he's a better teacher than I am. He gives people space to think. And I think he will often allow for that kind of sort of messianic speculation to go on as he then continues on in his ministry, teaching, role modeling, healing, that kind of thing. And the vision or the image gets clearer and clearer and clearer as his ministry matures or moves forward. So that people who are still questioning, they usually end up getting their questions answered. But I think he knows he's in it for the long haul, and it's not a sort of a one-off. Yeah, I have one shot at this, and that's going to be the end of it. And instead, he's looking at his ministry more holistically, and he's using a building blocks kind of approach. I'm going to show you this, and we'll let you think about it. I'm going to show you that. I'm going to teach this, and I'm going to do this miracle, and I'll let that settle and simmer for a while. And as God's Spirit works on people, then things begin to dawn on them, that then Jesus doesn't have to, lead them like a horse to water and then force their head under and make them drink. Instead, he's willing to let the process play itself out. That's my thought on that, Lynn. I'm hoping that I'm right, and I hope that helps. I noticed that there are a lot of people still hanging around. We have 3 pages of people. Folks like Shannon and Mark and Deborah. But you're welcome to. We've kind of established a tradition of this, I guess. A whole 4-week-long tradition, right? Do you have a question, Gloria, or comment? Or are we just waving goodbye?
I was waving goodbye, but last week I actually had some questions about Jesus being a rabbi, because you were saying that rabbis have disciples, but is there a formal way of becoming a rabbi? And what happens after a rabbi dies? Do the disciples Like, and is there a formal way of getting disciples, or do you just choose to follow rabbis? I think I just don't understand the cultural context of
Sure.
what happens.
After the time of Jesus, a practice of ordination actually developed. And to become a rabbi, you would have to have other rabbis who were acknowledged as such to do what is called smicha, which is the laying on of hands. That goes back to like Joshua with under Moses and stuff like that. So it's not without biblical precedent at all. It just doesn't seem like that had developed in Jesus' day. So you actually have scholars who take issue with the fact that the language rabbi was even used in the first century. I have a gigantic methodological problem with that, or evidential problem, because Jesus and John the Baptist in the New Testament are called rabbi. What do you do with all that evidence? I mean, verse after verse after verse after verse. It's not like they just, oh, well, that was a slip of the pen. I just wrote that down by accident. I kind of, was thinking about, in the future. No, people were called rabbi. Now, did it mean that he had ordination? That there wasn't any ordination. What it meant was that he was functioning as a master teacher who was wise enough and knew enough Torah and had enough personal charisma and all this other stuff to attract disciples. And so if you were a person who was versed in the Torah and you were an effective teacher and you were attracting disciples, by definition, people started calling you by that name. Even people that who weren't necessarily following you yet, or even agreeing with you on stuff, they would still recognize, okay, you're functioning as one of these master teachers with disciples that are a part of our culture, our society. So then what happens? I think the second part of your question was, what happens when a rabbi dies? Then I guess the people who are ready to become rabbis themselves, they become that. If they can attract disciples, then they are by definition rabbi themselves. If they are not yet ready, then they go and they apprentice themselves to another rabbi. That's the way that would work. If you became a rabbi in Jesus' world, your rabbi remains your rabbi for life. It's not like you graduate like we do, and then your teacher is no longer your teacher, your professor is no longer your professor. That's a relationship for life. We even hear about rabbis who outlive their students, who then go to their funerals and they lead the mourning processional in mourning over students that even gave them a hard time. I remember that in the Babylonian Talmud, there's an example of a rabbi, Reish Lachish, who actually did this. He went to a disciple's funeral, and they said, "Why are you even here? Didn't you hate this guy? Every ruling you gave, he gave 80 complaints about that." And he said, "Yeah, I know, but for every 80 complaints that he raised, I was able to teach this 80 times more carefully." And so Torah was expanded rather than contracted. So you have this lifelong kind of relationship between rabbi and disciple.
I guess to add on to that, then, is there like an informal disciples and formal disciples? Because like, where did the 78 come from? And did Jesus know every single one of them? Did he call every single one of them? Or do people just say, I want to follow your teaching, so I'm your disciple?
Yeah, you're talking about the 70 as opposed to the 12, right? I think that whole idea of 70 disciples is, and they're called disciples, right? Somebody can check us on that while we're talking. But that's only in the Gospel of Luke, okay? So Luke is the one who tells us about the 70 disciples. It's fascinating to me that the rabbis had a view of the world as containing 70 nations who spoke 70 different languages. And so it's Luke, who was a non-Jew, who's the most interested, Book of Acts, journeys of Paul, Peter at Cornelius's house. Luke is the one who's showing this incredible interest in the gospel getting to non-Jews and to, quote, the ends of the earth, the uttermost parts of the earth. And he's the one who is the one who reports Jesus sending out not just the 12, but also the 70. It's like even in Jesus' lifetime, Jesus was giving this kind of premonition or sort of a forewarning, a harbinger, if you will, of a worldwide, everybody inclusive relevance of the gospel, call of the gospel message. Every kindred, every nation, every tongue, and every tribe. And I just find it really cool that that's not some kind of a post-Jesus development, but Luke is telling us, he's giving us hints that are pushing us in the direction that we can root that impetus that everybody be included in the circle. We can root that in the person of Jesus, not just in his words like, go ye therefore into all the world and make disciples of all nations, not just in his words in the book of Acts, when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, you'll be my witnesses to the uttermost parts of the earth, but in his actions as well. He sent out the 70, and the 70 is not accidental. It's totally not accidental.
Dr. Nunnally, I think it's interesting, this idea of hypertexting. I think we've become perhaps a little lazy in our modern culture, but going back to the classics or Shakespeare or, even the American founding fathers, if you read their writings, they use this hypertexting all the time. They knew history, they knew the classics, they knew scripture, and they use this technique. They didn't elaborate all the details. They assumed that their audience knew what they were talking about, could make the connection.
Yeah, a perfect example of that is in Lincoln's famous statement, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." And you're right, that the founding fathers' works and words are shot through with references to scripture. I think that we're in danger of losing that because we're becoming a less biblically literate society and church. The further this thing, the longer this thing rocks on. So I guess what it means, this call to arms that I gave you this evening about, you guys, you took the course, you put up with me, you read the material, you watched videos and all this other stuff. You've already made your decision, and I know it's already been made, that you want to go deeper in this. You want to know even as you're known. You want to know this Jesus that gave his life for you. And you want to know him as well as you can know him on this side of eternity, not just in the next life, but now, in the here and now. You want to be able to communicate him more clearly to other people. You want to be able to relate to him in prayer and study and what have you, more closely or intimately or what. It's like a deepening friendship, and not to make it trite, but the more you know about somebody, the deeper the relationship goes and the more you appreciate them. It's almost natural. It's built into our DNA for it to be like that. Well, our relationship with Jesus is a whole lot more important than other relationships and all that other stuff. But the dynamics of all of that make relationship on the human plane possible are still in play. And so I'm right there with you. I want to know. I want to know him. I want to understand. If there are only so many red words in our Bible, they're precious because there are not many of them. And I want to lean in. I want to press in, and I want to understand what he said from his perspective, not me taking reformational period or modern period or whatever overlays constantly. I want to sit at his feet and understand what's coming out of his mouth in the same way that a first century Jew in the land of Israel would have understood what he said. And it's not always possible, but I think it's more possible than we ever dreamed it could be.
On that note, Dr. Nunnally, what is
Yes,
the
sir.
best material you've ever read on the Beatitudes in relation to first century mindset?
You're talking about modern scholarship, Rod? Okay, so for me, the best thing that I can read to understand Jesus is not modern stuff. And that's even if I wrote it, or Brad Young wrote it, or David Flusser wrote it, or David Biven wrote it, or Shmuel Safrai wrote it. The best stuff that we can get our hands on is the ancient material itself, the stuff that goes back to that time. And even when you think, wow, I'm just kind of wading through this and I haven't seen anything that really helped me with a specific example of something in the teachings of Jesus, at the same time, you're just building up a store of literary and cultural and linguistic information in yourself that is helping you fill out this picture of what the ancient world was like and how the ancients communicated. At some point, it's going to become incredibly relevant. I've never found 1 minute of my time reading ancient literature to be, quote, downtime or unfruitful. Never have. It's something in there somewhere. I've always, every reading period that I've had, I've come away with not usually one, but usually 4, 5, 6 things that have jumped out at me. And so I would say read the ancient texts. And it might be that I just finished the seated portion of a PhD course in Jewish backgrounds of the New Testament that I was teaching at the seminary. It was 8 hours a day, 5 straight days, Monday through Friday. It's just absolute killer. That's probably why I looked like maybe I was dead last week or something. I kind of was. That was day 4, the end of day 4 of 5. Well, anyway, what do I get these PhD candidates reading? The first thing that we hammer at is Josephus, because he's the easiest to understand. And the next thing is Philo of Alexandria's historical works. He's got a lot of philosophical stuff that just about drives me crazy. So we don't really focus on that. It's not really that helpful. But when he's talking history and travel on the Mediterranean, you know, his attitude toward Pontius Pilate, you know, and stuff like that, that's some important stuff. So Philo of Alexandria. Next is Between the Testaments, Apocrypha, and pseudepigraphical stuff. That's the 3rd section. The 4th section is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the 5th section is the rabbis. And I go from easiest to hardest to understand, you know, so that they're kind of easing into the material. It's not all equally hard or easy. It's kind of all over the place in terms of level of difficulty, but read those ancient sources. The summer before I started my doctoral program at Hebrew Union College, I determined to read all of Josephus. Did I tell you this already? No? So I got a copy of Josephus and I put it on the water tank on the back of the toilet. I read all of Josephus in one summer. I'm not sure what that says, but it's true. It happened. They call it multitasking, y'all. Redeeming the time, quote unquote.
So I have a question, Dr. Nunnally. I just have to say this though. I have students that have never read the Old Testament, you know, and so it's mind-boggling to try to get this across. But it reminds me of when my family took us to Disneyland, and my children had hardly watched any Disney because God had showed me what it had done to me way back when and the attitudes and stuff in it. And so, of course, we went with family. So we went to Disneyland, and my kids didn't get it because they didn't know any of the characters.
Yes.
You know, I mean, it was just a bunch of pretty colors and pretty stuff. And they're like, okay, yeah, whatever. And we're leaving. You know, I mean, you know, it was a circus. And
I gotcha.
but my question is this. And I am just scratching the surface of this myself. In fact, understanding this hypertexting, which I probably was introduced to maybe a year ago or more, just made me realize how little I know of the Old Testament. And of course, I have memory issues, so that doesn't help. But one of the things when I'm describing to people about, do you know the Jesus that you know? And where is that the real Jesus that was presented? Is if you don't know the Old Testament, then you don't really know Jesus. You have to manufacture a Jesus, and you're trying to manufacture it for your own needs and your own context and all of that. So in saying that, then to me, Jesus is 100% clarifying the New Testament. And when we study the different gospels and we say, okay, there's this much of Luke and Matthew and whatever, and John is most original, doesn't have much crossover. How much would you say of Jesus is, I hate to say this, original, because he is original, but it seems to me like it's almost all clarification and hypertexting.
All right, so the question is how, I'm not sure if I don't think I hear you asking the Bultmannian question of all the stuff that we have that Jesus was supposed to have said, how much of it did he historically really say?
No, that's
You're
not
not
what I'm
asking that.
No. Well, in your opinion, would you say that Jesus is constantly referring to the what is written in the Old Testament? And of course, he's admonishing the rabbinical additions to the word. We know that. Of course, that would be original in a sense because he's separating and clarifying the two. But he's also clarifying what the word was really saying and meaning. And is there a better way of saying that? Is my point, because I want to get that point across to students that I have. And how would you? How do you see that? I'm sorry if it's not very clear what I'm saying.
Yeah, I'm still struggling I don't want to do a shotgun approach thing on you because I don't want to waste your time.
Right.
So-
Okay. So the other thing is I'm dealing with the American-made Jesus, and I want them to see the Jewish Jesus. But you can't see the Jewish Jesus if you don't know the Old Testament.
Yeah, what I teach my students is if you want to really know Wave Nunnally, you don't go, well, you can go 5 houses down each way and you can ask, what do you know about the Nunnallys? But the best read that you're going to get on me, where things really start to pop, is when you ask my next door neighbors on both sides. And so if I say, if you've heard, everybody's heard, to understand Jesus, you've got to read the Old Testament. You have to understand, you got to read the Old Testament. And that's true insofar as it goes. But where you're going to really begin to get, these things around the edges clarified, is when you go to the immediate next door neighbors. And we're talking, the intertestamental period, not as far back as, the days of the kings of Israel and Judah, or the days of the Babylonian exile. We're talking about a half of a millennium, plus ago. But when you're talking about, for example, we read from Susanna tonight, that was 100 years before Jesus was born. If you're talking about, Dead Sea Scrolls, you're 200 years from when Jesus was born. If you're looking at the rabbis, depending on, which stratum you're dealing with, I mean, there's stuff from 200, 300 BC, but there's stuff that's first century, stuff that's late first century, early second century in there. You're talking basically contemporaries. If you're talking about Josephus, you're talking about a contemporary. If you're talking about Philo, you're talking about a contemporary. And what I find is that people, they go, yeah, the Old Testament, I read that and it was kind of boring and I didn't understand it and it seemed to be irrelevant. So I kind of went back to the Gospel of John because I thought that made, that was more relevant to me. Okay, well, they're looking for relevance. But then when you start talking about, hey, have you ever read any of the Dead Sea Scrolls? They're all available in English now. Oh, really? Well, yeah, no, but I could never afford, or I couldn't go to a school. They wouldn't let me see those things. No, you can buy them all for $11 online. It can be at your doorstep tomorrow. You kidding me? Not kidding you. Oh, well, man, that really sounds sexy. I'm going to get into that Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, you know? Then when they read the Dead Sea Scrolls, they go, golly, this is really hard to understand. I'm gonna go back to the Old Testament. That's why it's at the fourth level, even in doctoral studies. Take them through Josephus, take them through Philo, take them through apocryphal pseudepigraphical stuff. And then when they jump into the Dead Sea Scrolls, their response is, I've been wading around in the kiddie pool, man, and somebody just pushed me off the deep end. This is dense, textured stuff. But look, what people ask me, there's so much stuff out there. Where do you start? Now I just go, hey, jump in. The water's fine. Doesn't matter where, you just jump in. Start swimming in this wonderful world of intertestamental Judaism. Now, I got an email today from one of our librarians at the seminary, and she said, I want you to take a look at this book that's just been published, because it may be helpful for this course that you are teaching right now, this Jewish backgrounds of the New Testament. And I looked at it and I wrote her back and I said, no, this is that New Testament apocryphal stuff. This is that stuff from the 2nd century AD, 3rd, 4th, 5th century AD. That's not going to help you in terms of the backgrounds of the life of Jesus or the early church or Paul's writings or whatever. That's all happening afterward. So that might help with respect to the history of the early church and heresies that developed and the Gnostic gospels and all that stuff. But no, we're talking about between the testaments that bring us from the end of the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament right up to the doorstep of the ministries of Jesus, John the Baptist, Paul, and others. So again, I'll take you back. I'm going to take you, Grace, I'm going to take you back to the same place that I did with Rod earlier. You know, what's best to read? And the people that I studied under, Dr. Ellis Rivkin and Ben-Zion Wacholder and Eugene Mahali and Yitzchak Yerushalmi, read the sources, read the ancient sources. Where do you think these commentators and all these, modern, guys that are writing articles, myself included, where do you think that they're getting this stuff from? Well, cut out the middleman and go straight to the source. That's my argument, is read the ancient sources. And if you don't understand it, it doesn't mean that you're going to go to hell. It just means you go to the next thing or ask somebody or just keep waiting for better information. But, just get in there and start swimming around. Doesn't cost you an extra shekel, and it sure is a lot of fun.
Dr. Nunnally, on the concept of Jesus the teacher, speak to the thought that he was similar to Hillel in his teaching methods.
All right, so you have two great rabbinic figures that were the co-chairs of the Sanhedrin or Sanhedrin, whatever, in the first century, last of the first century BC and the beginning of the first century AD. Hillel was one. His partner, Shammai, was the other. And they both represented, these are two houses, are kind of like denominations within the movement that we call Pharisaism. They're both great rabbinic figures. They both taught both the written and the oral Torah. And Hillel seems to be, in most instances, more lenient. He's looking for a way to get the most people involved in obedience to the scriptures. You could state it more negatively and say he's just trying to lower the bar to where everybody can crawl over it. Okay, you could go that way, but you could also say he's trying to make biblical Judaism doable in the first century BC and first century AD. His partner, Shammai, was in the more stringent or strict school of Pharisaic thought. And so what I see in Jesus is that he more often references Hillel. That seems to be Jesus' more general approach. He's not trying to see how hard he can make it. He's trying to restore people, trying to get people back connected to God. All right. So, but I find a really interesting bifurcation in terms of positions that he takes. When he's dealing with ceremonial or ritual matters, Sabbath observance, ritual purity, blah, 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 he seems to take the position that looks like Hillel. When he's dealing with something that has ethical or moral undercurrents or ramifications, then he takes the stricter approach, like as in divorce, where he takes right down the line, he takes the position that was established in the previous generation by Shammai. So I see Jesus in a way as being an equal opportunity offender. He's a free agent, and he can dip into both of these worlds. But no doubt about it, more often when he quotes things like the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, whoever humbles himself will be exalted, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, the first will be last, the last will be first. He is referencing, without saying the name of who did it, he's referencing Hillel. And he's not doing it in a way that he's name dropping. He's not saying this is true because Hillel said it. We just follow him no matter what he says. What he's saying is it's true because it's true. And I'm saying so. So I'm putting my stamp of approval on something that somebody just happened to discover.
Hey, Dr. Nunnally.
Hello, Chava.
Hi. Okay, so we know that there were other people claiming to be the Messiah during the first century, and some of them had strong motivation to overthrow Rome. Do you think that would have had any influence on how early on Jewish leaders and Rome would have kept their eye on Jesus during his ministry? Are there any sources that would kind of speak to that?
Yeah, there are. Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 18, tells this fifth story about John the Baptist and his origins, and he tells it's by analogy. So I'm not jumping topics. I'm trying to say that the same kind of Romanesque sort of approach to these upstart movements that they saw as being problematic, it's what we see in John the Baptist, we see playing out in Jesus as well. So John the Baptist had no messianic aspirations whatsoever. He admitted, I'm not the Messiah, just straight up. And yet, the following that he had was so popular that he says that Herod Antipas arrested him, imprisoned him, and executed him because Herod thought this: better to intervene early and stop a problem before it gets out of hand than to wait and hope it resolves and it not resolve and end up in a massive revolt. So I see the Roman attitude toward Jesus as possibly being the same thing. In reality, though, Jesus never really had any problem with the Romans. And I don't think that they really perceived any problem with him until he got put on their plate by Jews who were jealous of his charisma and who were irritated with him cleansing the temple, maybe not once and maybe not even twice. We have John at the beginning of the chapter 2, at the beginning of the ministry, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke in Matthew 21 in parallels at the end of Jesus' ministry. I think we have 2 temple cleansings, and in reality, I think we may have 3. I think there may have been a 3rd cleansing that doesn't get reported in any of the Gospels. So we have a 3-year ministry because John reports 3 Passovers. And so Jesus is in the temple at Passover at least 3 different times. And I don't know that he could come to Jerusalem, see what the abuses, the excesses that were going on in the temple that didn't get fixed. And you have rabbis. This is an interesting study in itself. So when you have to write the paper at the end of the course, you might want to write on this topic. Before Jesus, a guy named Bava ben Buta, who was a contemporary of Herod the Great, and he went into the temple court and he saw that it was desolate. Nobody was there. Nobody could afford the sacrificial offerings because they jacked the prices up so high, and they'd created a monopoly, and they were disqualifying everybody's sacrifice. So they had to buy the sacrifices being sold in the temple. And he said, may the houses of those who made this house desolate be made desolate themselves. And so he went out and he bought a whole flock of sheep and goats and brought them into the temple. And he said, if anybody needs to offer an offering, a guilt or sin offering, let him come and take an animal, lay his hands on it, confess his sins over it, and offer the sacrifice. That was the way he resolved it. So that's before Jesus. Then Jesus comes along and he sees that there are problems with the temple. John the Baptist saw that there were problems with the temple. The Dead Sea community wouldn't go to the temple because there were problems. Okay, so there's that kind of intermediate time. And then the son of Gamaliel, who was the teacher of Paul, according to the book of Acts, Shimon ben Gamaliel went into the temple and he saw that the temple was desolate. This is in the 60s AD, right before the destruction of the temple. And he sees that the temple is desolate, and he asks what's going on here. He finds out that the cheapest offering that anybody could offer, which is what Joseph and Mary offered at the beginning of Luke, the 2 turtle doves, that they cost $1,500. $1,500 for 2 doves. So it says he sat down and made a ruling right there in the temple that lowered the cost of the poor man's offering from $1,500 down to $15. And then, and so he's realizing that there's this exorbitant cost of coming to worship in the temple. That's what Jesus was saying when he quoted Jeremiah 7:11. You've turned it into a den of thieves. It's not that there were pickpockets up there. It's that people were going to worship God and they were being prevented by this cost that was being driven ever upward by the people who were in charge of the temple. So who was it that got their nose so out of place, most out of place at Jesus' actions in, quote, cleansing the temple? It was the people who were running that monopoly. It was the people who were being enriched. It was the folks who had built these 6,000 square foot plus palatial mansions on the Western Hill that they could look down on the temple, their own personal fiefdom, and make decisions that would affect whether people could come in and truly worship God and go away sensing that their sins had been forgiven and their prayers had been heard by God. And whether it was Bava Ben Buta, or it was the Dead Sea community, or it was John the Baptist, or it was Jesus, or it was Shimon ben Gamaliel, Simon the son of Gamaliel. They were all saying the same thing. There is something horribly broken on that Temple Mount. And those people are the ones who said, we've got to step in. If we don't, every year he's going to come and he's going to do this. He's going to break the National Bank of Israel, the stock market of Israel, the Wall Street of Israel. And it's all it's doing is hurting us. It's hurting our bottom line. It's breaking our bank. And we're not, this will not pass one more year. He will not come back to Jerusalem and do this again. This stops here and it stops now. And it was for that reason that the Romans got drug into the whole thing. And it was not about his messianic identity directly. It wasn't about doctrine. It wasn't about Sabbath observance. It wasn't about ritual purity. Those were the arguments that he had with the Pharisees. The problem that he had with this Temple Mount thing was something going on with the Sadducee priests. And they had the connections with the Romans because they're the intermediaries. They're the liaisons. They're the ones who are really running the show. They're the aristocrats, the fat cats, the power brokers. And they had the connections on the inside to get their will done by this foreign power that could not be resisted. And so that's, I know that that's a lot longer answer than what you wanted, but I've got a document. I don't know if it was posted by Diane Wright or not, called The Enemies of Jesus. Have you seen anything like that? Okay, then I'll make another note to myself to see if I can get Diane to post that. You can have it. It's just a bunch of ancient sources that pretty much, you know, in a longer way in black and white, say what I just said there, because I'm not making this stuff up. I'm following the sources in this. The rabbis, for example, they say, we know why Shiloh was destroyed, and we know why the first temple was destroyed. Why was this last temple destroyed? And the answer is because they loved money and they hated each other. And it's said multiple times in the literature. Did you get that from Brad Young, Pastor Rod? No? Yes? You did? Does he teach that stuff too? Okay, take your word for it. So I think if it was just up to the Romans, they would have just probably left Jesus alone and hoped that he went away. Because you make a martyr out of somebody, then all of a sudden you got a movement on your hands, you know, and that actually did happen, as we know. We're part of it, right? 2,000 years ago, Roman Empire has been gone for, you know, a millennium and a half, but his movement's still around. So they don't want to do that. They don't want to stir up stuff that that's best left alone. But they just kind of got that dumped in their plate, dumped in their laps, and they just went ahead and followed through.
Brother, your afterglow is as good as your class.
Lord have mercy, Rod. You guys are just kind.
I totally agree. I have really enjoyed the class, and I look forward to it. You know, it kind of expands your horizons, and so I have your list of other sources to read, and I'm excited to see you know, what more there is, because it's so rich.
Well, if you're not, thank you. I appreciate that, Grace. If you're not already overdosed, you know, you can get all you want from at wavenunnally.com or Wave Nunnally on Facebook, Wave Nunnally on YouTube. And if it's a blessing to you, then just, you know, you can link to it, you can pass it on to other people, you can share, you know, all that stuff that you can do with your friends if it's helpful to you. There's plenty of stuff there, and it's all free. It doesn't cost anything. Well, here's my goal. My goal is twofold. Number one, I don't want you to take my name in vain. And number two, I want you to make sure you get your shekels worth. I don't want anybody to go away feeling like they've been short shekelled.
Not here, that's for sure. Thank you.
My pleasure. I love every minute of this. I live this stuff. It's an almost 24/7 thing, and I have no regrets. I kind of wanted to be a farmer, and I also thought it would be kind of cool to be in law enforcement, but this is a whole lot better than either for me. For other people, we need those kind of folks. If we don't, somebody's going to hurt us or we're going to be hungry. So we got to have people called into all areas of life to make this thing called society work. But for me, I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. Do you want me to bring up a topic we didn't get to tonight? Or do you want to just keep asking questions?
Yeah, bring it up.
Yeah.
Come on. You going to take good notes just in case I get in trouble with the folks that had to go put their kids to bed? Or
Yeah, sure.
go work the night shift or whatever it is that they're doing? All right, well, I may have mentioned this before in passing, but I wanted to, this is part of the teaching ministry of Jesus. I want you to become sensitized to the way that Jesus talks to different audiences in different ways. Have you ever noticed that? Just give you an example. Jesus doesn't go around handing out 4 spiritual laws tracts to everybody, you know, or leaving them at every restaurant he eats at. He gets right down at the level of whoever he's talking to. He talks to his disciples one way. He talks to the religious leaders another way. He talks to a woman at the well another way. You see what I'm saying? Without changing the message, he's changing the points of reference and kind of the level of expectation of knowledge and all of that stuff, depending on who the audience is. Just like you don't talk to your teenager the same way that you talk to your toddler, right? You know, Gucci, Gucci, goo. You don't say that to a 15-year-old unless you want to get in trouble, lose face. And I'm the same. I've got 2 generations of grandkids. I've got grandkids that are driving and working. I got grandkids that are barely out of diapers. It's insane. I never anteed up for this, but I couldn't get the thing turned off, you know, fast enough, and they just kept coming, and you know how it works. I didn't get a vote. Nobody consulted me about, you know, when kids were going to be born and stuff. I don't communicate with them the same way. I don't. So you know what I'm saying. The same thing goes for a lot of times with Matthew and the kind of people that he was hanging out with and the amounts of money that he knew about, you know, was familiar, was comfortable with handling. Those amounts of money are different when you get to Luke, and he's dealing with poorer people, and he's wanting this to be, you know, attainable, understandable by everybody. So even monetary amounts are going to be different. I think that Jesus, when he found a parable that, quote, worked, he used it multiple times. Oftentimes, then, if he's using it multiple times, he's going to have a different audience one time than he will the next time it comes time to trot that parable out. People that speak publicly, you understand what I'm saying. Not only that, but he has different locations where he's speaking. And so when he's speaking up north in a mostly agrarian kind of society, then his references are going to mostly be agricultural. When he's in Jerusalem, his references are going to be those that lie close at hand and are going to be understood more by urbanites. So I just want to encourage you in the same way that I was trying to sensitize you to some of the literary forms that Jesus was using, like poetic parallelism, or the kinds of things that we talked about tonight, hypertexting, the way he's dealing with Old Testament scripture and directing people's attention to a whole context back there, not just a couple of words or the verse that he quotes. By the way, the rabbis do this all the time. Rabbis are always, not just Jesus, but everybody, they're all hypertexting. They're always, you know, quoting a word or a part of a verse. Many times, the part of the verse, and I think that this is the case in Jesus' Den of Thieves, he's not complaining about just the ripoff. He's the real punchline there is this house is going to be destroyed. And it's going to be destroyed because of y'all. It's because of what you've done. You have brought this on yourself. Can't blame it on me. Can't blame it on my disciples. Can't blame it on God. You got to own this. You did this to yourself. He's grandfathering in, or he's clicking and dragging a whole context with those words. He's not showing off either, by the way. He's just relating to an audience that's unbelievably biblically literate. And you don't have to quote it all. They are there. You just get them started. They're there. All right. So the same thing goes for these locational differences. Galilee versus Jerusalem is an example. So to sensitize you to this, let me encourage you to be looking for where Jesus is when he's saying stuff. If he's in Galilee, you're going to hear him talking about things like planting and wheat and grapes and vineyards and soil types, foxes and grain grinding mills and harvest and stuff like that. That's what you're going to hear from Jesus when he's in an agrarian context. When he's in an urban context, you're going to hear him talk about the monuments of the righteous and the tombs of the prophets. Yes, by the way, that was poetic parallelism. You got it, didn't you? I saw some people's eyes light up. The monuments of the righteous and the tombs of the prophets. That's basically making the same point. But you don't get that out on hillsides in Galilee. You don't get that in wheat fields in the Jezreel Valley. You don't get monuments of the righteous and tombs of the prophets. You do get that in Jerusalem. So where did he say that? Anybody want to guess? You got it. Starts with a J, ends with an M, at least in English. Things like references to the temple or the gold on the temple. Or his reference, you will say to this mountain, okay? I haven't turned this loose except when I teach in Israel, but I have a feeling that he was talking about the Herodian there. And I have text. In the Babylonian Talmud tractate Bava Batra, page 3b to 4a, it says, if royalty shall say unto a mountain, be uprooted, then it shall be uprooted from its place and shall not return to its place. That one's slain in the flesh, Chava, right? I love it. So that only works when you're in and around Jerusalem. So it's either the Temple Mount or it's the Mount of Olives or it's the Herodian. I'm going to pick the latter of the last of the three. Things like the altar and everything upon it, quote unquote. Where does he say that? Jerusalem. When he talks about before the cock crows twice, you will have denied me 3 times. Cock crow. This has to do with the announcing the beginning and end of Sabbaths, feasts, Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. It has to do with the sounding of the watches of the night and of the last watch. The sound comes for priests to start their priestly duties, to start that day's work in the temple. So it doesn't even have to do with an animal. It has to do with the sound of that a human being makes. We've got the archaeology as well to prove that, to the place of trumpeting, to the house of trumpeting or the place of trumpeting. If you've been to Israel, you've seen that. It was found by Benjamin Mazar after the 6-day war was over in the late 60s. Those kinds of things, those things are not going to work in Galilee, but they will work in Jerusalem. So keep an eye on, just ask yourself when you're reading these words of Jesus, where is he saying this? And then start thinking about, okay, this is a deeply textured message, and he is contouring his message. He's telegraphing his message to an audience in a specific place with a certain set of givens, you know. So do that, and I think you have, again, this is not about parsing Greek verbs or about memorizing Hebrew vocabulary. You can do this in English, and you don't have to be a quote specialist. You don't have to be ordained. You don't have to be graduated from seminary. Anybody can do this with an English Bible. These are super simple questions. Where is he saying this? Who's he talking to? And what are his points of reference? Those are just common sense questions. We do it all the time in our communication today. Why won't we do it with Jesus? I think it's just that we haven't been taught to do that. Did I tell you this story about my son? When he was a little kid, he was still in the single digits of years. He was probably, I don't know that he was even in school yet. He was sitting on the floor. I was in seminary. He was watching TV, and no one on the screen's mouth was moving. The narrator was narrating, and he turned back around at his mom and dad, my wife and me, and he said, "Who's that talking?" It was a great question, right? If you can't see somebody's mouth moving, then who do you know? How do you know You know, what's going on? What's the context going on here? He's looking to contextualize the message. Who's talking? I thought it was a very insightful question for like a 3, 4, 5-year-old.
Hey, Dr. Nunnally, on that reference you just made about the cock crowing 3 times, you don't have to give a long explanation unless you want to, but could you at least give me enough to go fishing for it on my own? What were you just saying there, that the cock crowing wasn't actually referring to the bird, it was referring to traditions around the temple and the watches of the night, you said?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we are in Tractate Bava Batra of the Mishnah. We're told that the rabbis forbade the raising of roosters, a cock, for the raising of roosters in Jerusalem and its surroundings, because of concern about them being scavengers, bringing pieces of corpses, you know, because Jerusalem's surrounded by graveyards, into the holy city and either defiling the holy city or, God forbid, the temple, right? Or a synagogue or a priest or something like that. All right, so then also there's a gigantic historical problem or you know, problem with reality when you get in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verse, what is it, 32, I believe? Yeah, where Mark says, has Jesus saying, truly I say unto you, this night before the cock crows twice. So your question, the question is, why would Peter or why would Jesus assume that there would be a rooster, who, by the way, can't be in Jerusalem or around it? Why would you assume that that rooster would crow 2 times before the sun came up, this night before the cock crows twice? And the Greek there, also the Hebrew behind it, whether it's the Greek phone alector or the Hebrew kriata gever, both of those can be translated the crowing of a rooster or the sound of a man. It's just a weird quirk of language that both of those phrases, the Greek and the Hebrew, can have these 2 very divergent meanings: the crowing of a cock or the sound that a man makes. So this is discussed in an article written by a student of mine. His name is Mark Turnage. And all you've got to do is type this in. I'll give you the title of the article. Sometimes a rooster is not a rooster. You might even be able to remember that. Sometimes a rooster is not a rooster. And if you want to put in the word the name Turnage, you know you're going to get, that's the first thing that'll come up. So it's online and it's free to access. It'll give you most of the other references, you know, like that Bava Batra reference to in the Mishnah about the prohibition against raising roosters in Jerusalem. And then you'll get references to Josephus, where he talks about the call of a man that sounds the watches of the night and that sounds the beginning of the next day, and that calls the temple priests to their stations to start preparing the temple for the next day's worship and stuff like that. It's just a bunch of good information all over the place in Josephus and in the rabbis.
Dr. Nunnally,
Yes.
this is Mary. I just wanted to ask you if this idea of looking at what Jesus is saying can also be used in the reverse to kind of locate where he is at the time he's saying something in particular. One of the guides that I've used in Israel, I think you know him, Adrian Weisberg, he was telling us that, you know, we can kind of know where Gamla, where the city on the hill is, and that he was saying that was Gamla because of this idea.
Yeah, how did you know I knew Adrian?
Well, he's the one who turned me on to you. So
Well, he is a mensch. He is a true mensch of the old school.
yes, he taught me so much. It's unimaginable. Yeah.
I love Adrian. We exchanged text just a couple of days ago. So Adrian and a good friend of his, Omer Eshel, do you know that name?
I think I've heard it, but I don't know.
Yeah, he was one of the kind of regional directors of the Israeli Department of Ministry of Tourism. But anyway, he and Omer and Adrian are good buddies, and they are both of the opinion that Jesus' city set on a hill that can't be hidden is Gamla. But we're great friends, love them both to death. I'd take a bullet for either one of them, they would for me. But we don't agree on this. I think that it is Susita or Hippus, and there are two reasons, neither of which can be replicated by Gamla. Hippus can be seen all around the Sea of Galilee. Gamla can only be seen from the northern shore. So there's a geographical issue there. A second issue is function. We get in the Jerusalem Talmud, there's a rabbi named Rav Ami. And Rabbi Ami says that you can tell when Shabbat is about to begin. In other words, you're using a time clock, using Susita or Hippus as a time clock, when the rays of the setting sun settle on the public buildings of Susita. And so you know that everybody around that lake then is referencing Susita to know when to begin and end labors, and when certain activities are allowed or not allowed. Now, Rav Ami is addressing an issue of circumcision. What happens when you have two Torah commandments that are in conflict with one another? And this is what's being discussed at that point in the Jerusalem Talmud. So you can't do work on Shabbat, but what happens if a kid's 8th day, a male Israelite, his 8th day of life falls on Shabbat? Do you still circumcise them? Well, the first thing that you have to prove is that the baby was born at a time when the 8th day would be Shabbat. And you determine that on the basis of whether the sun had gone down or was still shining on Susita. Also, you have in the rabbis that they were navigating the Sea of Galilee using Susita as a lighthouse. None of this stuff is happening with Gamla. Another thing is that they're giving directions using Susita. Another thing that the rabbis are doing is that they're determining who had a responsibility to tithe. Because see, tithing is basically a land of Israel reality. And if you're over in the Decapolis, which is mostly Gentile, then you are exempt from tithing the produce of your fields. And so Susita was being used as that point of demarcation between majority Jewish inhabitation that would mark the land of Israel, that would bring you under Torah law for tithing, as opposed to if you are to the left or to the east or to the east, basically east of Susita, Hippus, then you don't have to tithe because you're not living in the quote land of Israel. So for really important stuff, circumcision, Sabbath keeping, tithing, navigating the Sea of Galilee, giving directions and stuff, you're all everybody is looking for their cues to not Gamla, but Susita, Hippus. So that's my position, and I've written on this in a couple of articles on Light of the World. If you haven't already looked at it, looked at the articles, it's online, and I think I've probably got some videos out there too. I just don't remember at this point.
I'll check those out. Thanks. Would you
Yeah,
agree that rabbis reference things while they're speaking that are within their sight?
Typically, yes. So whether it's Gamla or it's Susita, the answer again is that these are great examples of Jesus doing that. And if the Sermon on the Mount is given at on the northern shore, then from a lot of places along the northern shore, you can see Gamla. From all around the Sea of Galilee, there's not a place that I've ever stood anywhere around the entire circuit, the 13 miles long by 7.5 miles wide. You can see Susita Hippus from all of it, from everywhere. I think that's the reason why there's so much in the rabbis about it. You mostly have to go to Josephus for Gamla. There are a
Gives
couple
me
of
good
there are a couple-
ammunition.
Pardon?
It gives me good ammunition for conversations with them.
Yeah, well, it's we've had the discussions already. I can't convince them, but the cool thing is they can't convince me either. So turnabout is fair play.
I have a question. When did Jewish influence kind of disappear on the east side of the Sea of Galilee? Because we have like the half tribe of we have a couple tribes, half tribe of Manasseh, and they seem to disappear, and it seems much more of a Roman, Greek, and Decapolis influence. So was there a time when the Jewish influence of the 2.5 tribes disappeared?
I don't think that it ever disappeared completely. I had a discussion with Omer Eshel, and he says that one of the really neat recent developments, is the discovery of several first century synagogues on the Golan, and that's what we're really talking about is the Golan here. But I think that Jewish presence or Israelite presence was diminished at the time of the Assyrian invasion, when the northern tribes were taken captive, or at least most of the population was taken captive back in the late 700s BC. But there is significant Gentile presence. Even though there are pockets of Jewish communities on the Golan, including in the first century, there's significant Gentile presence in the first century BC, because we have references from Strabo, and he's using the word Decapolis already, this loose-knit federation of 10 up to 14 cities that was a reality in Jesus' day. And basically everybody knew it, and that they never were under either the Roman prefect procurator or any of the or the sons of Herod the Great. So there was a significant Gentile presence there, and that reality is reflected in the works of the rabbis, where they're talking about to tithe or not to tithe based on geographical location. One of the things that I hope you guys are seeing as we're beating these ideas back and forth is the world of the Bible is not pretend or make believe. There are very real political, geographical, agricultural, sociological, theological dynamics that are going on. All of this stuff is real stuff that can be tracked. It can be tracked down. And another huge takeaway point, that's big picture stuff, but another huge takeaway point is that there is a tremendous amount of material out there, whether the data is coming at us from the world of geography or archaeology or literature or whatever. There's just a ton of stuff out there that's available, and we don't have to do everything by guesswork. One of One of the teachings of Hillel was don't tithe over much by guesswork. You know, you're likely to underestimate, right? Or you overestimate and your family goes hungry. Don't tithe over much from guesswork. So I say, let's don't do this biblical study stuff just by, hoping against hope. Let's get, put our finger in the wind, or let's just kind of horseshoes and hand grenades this thing. It's general vicinity sort of stuff when there's so much material that's available for us to access and to apply to the world of biblical studies. Knowing what we know, why would we do that? Here's a related question. Knowing what we know, that there's all kinds of information available, and that whenever you posit a theory, a hypothesis, a suggestion, an interpretation, you should have some kind of evidence. And yet for decades and decades, ever since I came into the body of Christ, we have consistently let people who write paperback books and who preach on TV and on radio and stuff like that get away with the most incredible flights of fancy that I have ever heard in my life. And we never expect of them to cite a source. It never comes up. Like, how do you know that? Something as simple as that. How can I know that? Could I read those texts that you're referring to? My question is, why is it that, why do they get away with that sort of stuff? And then we turn, the very next program that comes on, the next pastor will offer another interpretation based on his reading and no evidence, and it's completely contradictory to the one that we just listened to. And some kind of way we sublimate that stuff, and then we have to live with that cognitive dissonance. And I hate that because it hurts faith. It doesn't build faith, it decreases faith. It ends up that people will go, well, you know what? I would never have been able to come up with that. So I guess I'm just a failure at reading my own Bible. Or they come up with this, well, you know what? The Bible's just evidently it's true what the detractors say, and the Bible's just full of contradictions. No, interpretation's full of contradictions. The Bible doesn't have a problem here.
Hey, this is why I was aggravated, and I kept saying, why do we do this schizophrenic Christianity? All I want is truth. I want Jesus' truth.
Yes, Lisa, I appreciate that. I've been pursuing that since I got saved. I have been on a dogged pursuit, even before I got saved. I didn't know it. I have just been on a pursuit of truth, come what may, whatever the cost. Doesn't make any difference how many rocks I got to turn over to look under them to see what I can learn. It doesn't make any really difference what other people are saying. I don't mind marching to the beat of a different drum as long as I am following the evidence. And I think that if we could just get the body of Christ thinking in those terms, we'd have a stronger witness. We'd have people that were grounded on the solid rock and wouldn't be shaken about and tossed to and fro and carried about every time some problem happens, or a hurricane hits and we've got to figure out again for the umpteenth time, was that God that did that, or did somebody do something wrong? Is this God's judgment? Or and we'd be wringing our hands and sitting on the sidelines because our faith is just grounded. The average Christian is grounded on such shifting sand, and it's because we just, if somebody can yell or stomp or spit or shout, loud enough, then we must have to believe them. And my response is no. If you don't have book, then you don't get to play. If you don't have evidence, you don't get to speak into the discussion. Because everybody's got an opinion. They're kind of like noses. We've all got one. That doesn't move the ball at all.
Dr. Nunnally, I have a question that you made reference to indirectly, but topically. On Luke 13:4, where Jesus does his CNN moment about the tower in Siloam that falls.
Yes. What did you want to know about that?
What is that? I mean, is there some sources that can give us some insight to, is that a CNN moment to something they knew that we're unclear?
Okay, so where it happens, Luke 13, is Jesus is in Jerusalem there, isn't he? Okay, well, that's the reason he brings it up, because the Tower of Siloam must be at the Pool of Siloam, right around in that general area. And there was a major gate, especially that pilgrims used to access the city. They didn't just go straight across the Kidron Valley and go into what we call the Golden Gate as evangelicals, or what the sources call the Eastern Gate, or the Shushan Gate, or the Gates of Mercy. Because if you did, then you'd be breaking a rabbinic law that says you don't make the temple court a pathway. You just don't cut across you go to the temple to worship, not to cut through, because it's quicker. And so the pilgrim's route that's going to, by the way, was uncovered by Eli Shukron. It's going to open up within a year, where people can actually walk those same steps that the man in John 9 that was born blind goes up and down those steps, and he's going to the Pool of Siloam. Okay, well, that connects that gate complex there. Evidently, it was still under construction in Jesus' day, as was the temple, by the way. There's construction going on all over the place. It's kind of a holdover from Herod the Great's building projects. Now it's been undertaken by his sons, by his grandsons, by the temple authorities, and, some of it by Pontius Pilate. We hear about him building an aqueduct and stuff like that in Josephus. And so it's evidently a part of that building of that whole area around the Pool of Siloam and the gate and what have you. Towers are usually associated with gates. You put a tower there to protect the gate, because anytime you open up a place in the wall to put a gate, then that becomes an access point. It becomes a weak spot in the city's defenses. And so evidently there was some kind of a construction accident, and people died as a result of it. Jesus just raises this as a current event, right? It's on everybody's mind. And in everybody's mind, they're wrangling with this issue of theodicy. When there's an accident, is that because God judged those people? And so Jesus just kind of throws a monkey wrench into people, the common, to sort of, I don't know, thinking that when bad stuff happens, it's because the people were bad. And I think Jesus is trying to jog their thinking a little bit, jerk them into a reality. Is, it would be really nice if life was that easy, and that good people always get good stuff and bad people always get bad stuff. But life is messy because humanity's messy. And so it's not always easy to draw straight lines like people like to draw, with simple bumper sticker or chariot sticker answers to everything. And it's just not, it doesn't often reflect well on God when we do that kind of broad brush, paint everything with the same hue, shortest distance between 2 points. Just the first thing that pops into your head, that must be the right answer kind of approach to life. Wouldn't it be cool if life was that easy? Or it would be boring. I don't know if it'd be cool or boring.
Be helpful to a pastor.
Yes, it would. I can definitely see that. People are looking for easy answers too. If you got one, then man, you're going to be successful. They want it, you got it. Hey, good to go. That's just not the way the world's set up, though.
Dr. Dunley?
Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't you, I meant to say, I don't know if I said Dunley, it's getting late. I meant Nunnally. But Wouldn't you say that archaeology is really helping with the biblical accuracy? Just like the city of David, could you elaborate on the biblical accuracy coming out of those finds? Because that's pretty recent. And I've been over there and doing what I'm doing in Shiloh is different than over the archaeological work in the city of David. But I've been as a tourist there, and I find that fascinating.
Totally.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I am like, I'm not a trained archaeologist either, but I've been accessing archaeology for so long, teaching people on site in Israel, as well as teaching classes here and in other places in the world. And I'm super excited by it, because it appears to me, I think that there's something, if I use the word eschatological, is that bad for everybody, for some people? I see most people have got themselves muted in every way that they possibly can, but is that, if I use the word end timesy, okay, last days kind of thing, I think there's something, I believe that there's something happening there. In the same way that I see, for example, the Messianic movement in the land of Israel. I don't think that these are accidents. I think there's a confluence of events going. And I think that what's driving this archaeology thing, I mean, just think about it. Israel is the most excavated place in the world, correct? Correct, all right? And yet Israel is like 99% unexcavated, even with places they've located and said, this is biblical X, Y, or Z city, right? They don't bother excavating the entire thing. They excavate a piece of it. They're looking for a palace, a temple, a gate, you know, where records are kept and those kinds of things. That's what the archaeologists are looking for, but they don't always find it. The place they think the gate might be, it's not there, or maybe once was there, but somebody at some point in time, they moved it to some other place in the city wall, like Dan, etc. All right, so what is amazing is, and I did a whole sermon on recent discoveries and how those discoveries are clarifying or confirming the biblical record. And and people just went crazy over the stuff. And how much can you do in 30 minutes, right? Yeah, you just hit high points. But there has been such an avalanche of stuff that has been discovered in the last decade or 20 years or something. And every year, it used to be every few years, something of passing interest would show up in the archaeological record. Now, every year, it's not one thing or two things, it's like a half a dozen things. I have to keep up with Jerusalem Post, Times of Israel, Biblical Archaeology Review. I mean, just multiple sources to keep up. I have to listen, get it from my friends in Israel, like Adrian Weisberg that somebody mentioned just recently, or Omer Eshel, or just anybody, to get the most recent stuff, because there is just this effluviance of stuff coming out of the ground. It's constant. It's just like a constant barrage. And this is what I think is happening. The world, all the way back in the empirical age, the scientific age, the 20th century, and ever since the Enlightenment, people have been saying, where's the proof? I want the evidence. Give me some facts. Give me some physical, tangible reality that I can observe and I can measure, that I can see, that I can translate, that, I don't just, not just theology, not just a philosophy, not just people's opinions and stuff. I want cold, hard facts and figures, reality. And it looks like to me, just based on the sheer amount of stuff that's coming out of the ground, that God has said, okay, you want to doubt me? You want the wiggle room to write your own check? You want to play in the gray area and stuff? Now watch me turn the spigot on. You want proof? I'm going to cover you up with proof and truth. And that's what I see as being the big picture of what's going on. It's earth shaking. It's seismic, what's happening in the world of archaeology. And I'm not saying this because I'm trying to recruit, volunteers to work on my excavation. I'm not doing this to raise money for my excavation. Why? I don't excavate because I'm not an archaeologist. But I spend lots of time having dinner with these guys and reading articles and paying attention to news reports and stuff like that, paying attention to what my friends are telling me in Israel. And it is amazing what is going on in the land of Israel, just in terms of the amount of data that's coming out of the ground. I'm loving every minute of it. I can't wait to see what's going to turn up next.
You know what's fascinating is I feel that God is revealing what he wants us to find right now. That's, it's all in his hands. So we're uncovering what he's allowing us to uncover, which is so beautiful.
Look, I think that you're right, Cindy. That was another, in a sense, part of my response that I kind of let go, but I was moving in that direction when I was talking about Israel is the most excavated country in the world, and yet there's just so little of it that's excavated. The odds are that we should not have things like the Hezekiah seal or the Isaiah the prophet seal or the pure to God token or the bell of the golden bell on the high priest's garment or the House of David inscription or any of that, the Gezer calendar or the material that has come out of Keapha, Sha'araim, or Shiloh. And yet we've got it. I think that God is helping. These are happy accidents that I think he's behind. When you hear people say things like, I think God is up to something, there should be an S on the end of the word something. He's up to a whole bunch of stuff. He's got his finger in a whole lot of pies. One of them, I believe, is people who are even unbelieving archaeologists like Yisrael Finkelstein from Tel Aviv University. Look, it's the people at Tel Aviv University that found out. Did we talk about the donkey poop last week? We didn't? Okay, well, it's Tel Aviv University and Yisrael Finkelstein that found that the donkey poop at Timnah down near Eilat actually has what it's composed of is fodder that contains stuff that's only grown in the area around Jerusalem. And so now the people at Tel Aviv University are having to rethink their whole idea about a united kingdom under a David and Solomon, where there was a strong united government that is able to carry out trade and mining operations and stuff like that, that would allow for fodder to be imported into Timnah, couple of hundred miles south, all the way from Jerusalem. And why would it be coming from Jerusalem? Because the people in Jerusalem want that copper that's being mined at Timnah. I think that's really, really cool. I think you got people who, Christian archaeologists like Scott Stripling that you work for, and people like Yossi Garfinkel, who is an observant Jew and teaches at Hebrew University. And the same stuff is coming from both of these, both divisions of the house, if you will. That's good for both faith communities, believing Jews and believing Christians. And I think it's equal, no matter who it is, Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, Bar-Ilan University, Jewish excavators, Christian excavators. I think it's good for the unbelieving community because they're having to deal with this stuff. And it's almost like high time. I think it's great for them to, okay, God says, God's listening and you're demanding evidence, and God is saying, okay, I'll give you the evidence. Now, after I've given you the evidence, now you step up to the plate and hit the ball. Ball's in your court, to change the metaphor to tennis. Glad you brought that up, Cindy. I appreciate it. I think that's a fruitful conversation.
Thank you. What's beautiful is when we're in Shiloh, we'll have the Bible open and, the Philistines, of course, conquered and conquested that and burned it. And we find the burn layer. It's just amazing to be reading that as we're unearthing that. And it's just, that's what's so beautiful, just to be on that little plot of land. That's where the tabernacle or the tent of meeting rested for 300 years. That's where Hannah prayed for Samuel. And it's just amazing where the ark was stolen by the Philistines. It's just a beautiful plot. We're unearthing the tabernacle, and we're only in year 3. COVID got us a little behind. So it's a 10-year project. But I will tell you, we found a pomegranate from a priestly robe just last year. How beautiful is that? And so it's
What
just
was it?
amazing.
Was it made of ivory?
Yeah, it looked like just kind of a ceramic type,
Ceramic.
Yeah. It looked like a little bell. You can Google it and see it. And it's just amazing to be able to unearth that and to say, kind of go along with what we are surmising is in that location. So.
In that sermon that I preached a couple of weeks ago, I showed a video, an aerial of Shiloh, and then some ground level shots. And I showed those 2 outcroppings of rock that are worked by human hands. And when you measure the distance between those, they run east-west, right? On the northern end of the tell, it conforms to the right down to the cubit, exactly what the dimensions of the tabernacle are, as described in Exodus chapter 25, chapter 40, etc. And then another thing about Shiloh is those pits of sacrificial bones.
Yes.
They're all of mosaically appropriate sacrificial animals, and only the right side of the animal, which is the portion that the priests were given after the sacrifice was over. The rest went to the sacrificer.
Well, we're having a heyday in Finkelstein's dump because a lot of those bones were dumped, and we've unearthed them and uncovering them. So, he was there in the 70s, or I think the 80s.
Yes, 80s.
And we're refuting some of what he uncovered and what he's, wrote on. And it's amazing to be able to see that and to come up with a scenario of, and even the position of the tabernacle versus kind of where their dwellings might have been based on the smell of the dead animals, where they could have placed the tabernacle. Stripling's not so sure it wasn't moved around somewhat in that time period.
That's what he told me when we
Yeah.
talked at Shiloh a couple of years ago, was he thought that because of the, piling up of bones and stuff like that, it was probably in, he said, at least 3 different locations. So I'm okay with that. That doesn't bother me at all. It kind of makes sense. This belief that came out of evangelicalism that the Hinnom Valley was a garbage dump and was constantly burning. And that's where they threw the bodies of dead criminals and stuff like that, which has been refuted by Gordon Franz, a guy that I went to school with in Israel 100 years ago. But he did 500 core samples and found that there's no burn layer in the entire Hinnom Valley. So there goes that whole reconstruction. And there were problems with it even before Franz's work. For example, Jews didn't leave people unburied, period. Even criminals, you bury them. If you have to get special permission, like in Philo's work or in the Gospels, you take them down off of crosses early before Shabbat and you bury them, right? In the book of Tobit, they're burying people that were, supposedly criminals and had been killed outside the city for whatever. And he was ritually impure and couldn't re-enter the city because he had been burying people. Jews bury people. And the other amazing thing has to do with, prevalent wind direction and geography and stuff like that. That's what you said about Shiloh reminded me of this. What normal group of people would build a city and then build their city downwind from the garbage dump? The prevailing wind in Jerusalem is from the west to the east. So if you were going to have a garbage dump, you would put it in the Kidron Valley, not in the Hinnom Valley. Otherwise, you're having to smell this rotten smell and, according to the theory, dead bodies and smoke and stuff like that being blown across your city every day of your miserable lives. It's none of that reconstruction makes any sense. So when Gordon finally pulled the trigger and did the core samples, he basically proved what made sense from the beginning anyway. So that whole, kind of shared ignorance or passed down ignorance, hopefully is beginning, I haven't heard it in a long time, beginning to abate. But a lot of times the best antidote to that weirdness is just ask yourself, does this make sense? Does this pass the, no pun intended, smell test? And a lot of times, if you'll just stop and think for a minute, just stop and think for a second, you go, no, that really doesn't make sense. Even if God had never created a Gordon Franz and he had never done his work, it still wouldn't make sense.
Chandler Collins from last term, when we were in Qumran, noticed that the graveyard for Qumran was on the east side. And he said, it's interesting that, is it just the prevailing wind to go from west to east so you don't smell the graveyard, or were they mirroring Jerusalem, or both? So he did indicate something similar.
You know what? I like that. And it's true. The graveyard, I think, there are 1,004 identified graves at Qumran, and they are on the east side of the settlement. The Valley of the Kings, the Kidron, the places where the kings of Judah were buried, that's east side of Jerusalem. It's kind of like natural ventilation. Blows that funk right out into the wilderness.
I don't know if anybody knows, but there's a series. It's on YouTube. It's called In Search of a King. And that Scott Stripling is on there, and it shows Shiloh, and it talks about what Cindy was talking about.
What's the name of it?
In Search of a King.
Okay. And where is it shown?
It's on, I found it on YouTube.
It's on YouTube.
Yes.
Okay.
Y'all can go to Shiloh Network News. They have their own news network. And so everything's recorded out there and it's beautifully done. So the kind of the umbrella organization is Associates for Biblical Research out of Pennsylvania. And I just have happened to get close to Scott because he's near me. We're out of the Houston area. So I see him just in other endeavors and have gotten to know him really in that way. But I was just a random person that signed up 4 years ago to go to the dig. And that's how I learned about it and certainly experienced it. But yeah, they showcase and market that very well. So anybody can do it. As Wave, you probably know that it's not hard to get on these digs. What do you do, Wave? Or you don't do a dig? You don't do an archaeological?
I visit tons of them.
Okay.
And I listen carefully to archaeologists, and I keep up with, and I read. So I've been at it long enough. I know basically how the archaeological game is played. Both the politics of it, the fundraising part of it, as well as the actual practice of archaeology. I know about stratigraphy. I know about pottery dating. I am comfortable with, squares and record keeping, and I'm just not a formally trained archaeologist, and I have so much other stuff to do, and teaching in Israel, teaching groups, training guides, and then teaching and writing and publishing here and stuff, that my cup runneth over. I mean, maybe in another life, you know, in the Olam Haba, the world to come. Maybe when I grow up, I'll be an archaeologist. But I love these guys, Scott Striplings and Gabrielle Barkai and
Chris McKinney's teaching right now.
Like
Chris McKinney's teaching, taking his class on Wednesday mornings.
Ah, so you're double dipping then, huh?
I'm triple dipping. I'm also doing, I'm doing Dr. Paul Wright on, I don't know when that's on, this morning, Thursday morning. I'm in Houston, so it's nighttime.
You know, there's a term for people like you. They call them gluttons for punishment. But I'm a dyed-in-the-wool glutton for punishment too. You don't do 3 master's degrees and a PhD and drag your family all over the world if you're not kind of bought and paid for. Are you guys ready to go to bed? Wherever you are, James is ready, I think.
I see daylight somewhere. Grace, where are you?
We're in Oregon.
Oh, it looks like daylight outside.
It is. It's still light here for it's yeah. It's
Oh, okay.
only 8 until 9. Yep.
Wave, this is Matt Switzer. I emailed you last week. My son was graduating. I've had rolling blackouts. It was 104 today. I'm just north of San Francisco. If
Wow.
there's any way I could get a copy of this recording, I sure would appreciate it. I have not done a good job of being sanctified, as you talked about a few weeks ago.
Yes, I'm being constantly purgated and need every bit of it. All right, so yeah, I'll see if I can get those links to you. And I think I responded back and said I'd do my best to get that stuff out. It's been an insanely busy time. You would think summer and, you know, you're retired and all this other stuff. Last week, I was blessed to survive, you know? And
Well, it sounds like a long, long week for you. I
was
also wrote you an email that I'm going to be in Israel for 3 weeks, end of September and October. I was going to lead a pilgrim group following the footsteps of Jesus, but when the rockets started flying, people bailed. So I'm still planning to go. I don't know if you will be over there, but I'd love to figure out some ways to sit at your feet. This is the area I need to get into next. I've done a lot with biblical geography, and I feel like the intertestamental stuff is what I really need next. So I would love to just listen more. I've ripped through Josephus and the Apocrypha and at your suggestions, and just I feel like it's like a whole different world to me. So thank you. You've opened up a ton.
Yeah, my pleasure. When did you say that you were going to be there?
I am going to be there end of September, the 21st. Yeah, I get it on late on the 20th, and I'll leave on October 8th.
Yeah. So there are a couple of guide courses that I'm going to be teaching right around that time.
Okay.
So maybe let's stay in touch with each other, because there's a possibility that we could overlap some there. I would love that myself.
That'd be wonderful. I'd love to buy you a meal at some point if you've got a free few minutes, and would love to, maybe if there's a way I could jump into some of that. I'll be in touch. I don't mean to monopolize the class, but thank you very much for all you're doing.
My pleasure. Thanks for all that you're doing as well. I have a lot of these guides that I have taught in guides courses that follow some stuff that I'm doing, like YouTube, etc., Facebook. And so I put out there recently, when the next time that I'm in Israel, I'm going to make sure everybody knows about it, and I'm going to set up certain times where I'm going to be like at the Aroma that's over there in the Mamila Mall, right across from Jaffa Gate.
Yep, of course.
And it's kind of it's an easy meeting place. Buses stop there, did the whole thing. And so I said, I'm going to set up some times where I'm just going to be there for 2-3 hours at a time. And anybody that wants to stop by, visit, do some Talmud Torah together, then that would be awesome. And man, people came out of the woodwork, and I still, I guess I'm 65 and I'm still not comfortable in my own skin. I can't believe anybody would walk across the street to hear this half-baked Virginia accent, talk about anything, car mechanics or computer science or Bible or whatever. I'm just constantly surprised that there are, like 150 of you guys out there, and it's 10:30 and junk. And it's like, are you kidding me? This has got to be an alternate universe, kind of a Waves World kind of reality.
I will love to party on, and this is like the balm of Gilead to me. So thank you.
Party on, Garth.
I'm going to be there, Dr. Nunnally. I'm going to be there with Adrian in October. So I'd like to, maybe we could stop by and say hey to you too.
That would be awesome. Maybe I'll just jump on the bus with you and Adriano's.
That would be so cool.
I asked Adrian one time, I said, how in the world did you end up with, as a Jew, the name of the most hated Roman emperor in all of the interaction between Jews and Romans? And he said, I don't know. I think it had something to do with being born British. Hadrian's Wall and all that stuff.
Exactly.
Anyway, he and I have some gloriously hilarious times together when we're working together in Israel.
He called you his mentor.
When he writes me, he starts out Mori v'Rabbi. That's a little humbling.
I'd say deserve.
I'd say jury's still out, but that's just me.
I wanted to go back to archaeology, the class that I took with Chandler, the dig in Shiloh. He said, well, he doesn't always agree with it's not the data, but it's some of the, what would you call it? The
interpreting the data.
Interpretation might be different. He said they're excellent scholars and do some of the finest archaeology he's seen with the wet sifting and how they're really careful with everything they do. And he said it's just some of the finest that he's seen, and he really appreciates that, even though he doesn't always agree with the final interpretations. So I thought that was a really high thing for Chandler to say. And the other thing is, I'm a big fan of Eilat Mazar, and was really sad to hear that she had passed away. And
she did. I did not know that.
Yeah, and even if Israel Finkelstein, who's not, they don't always agree in their assumptions. He said she's one of the finest. She was one of the finest archaeologists and had such an enthusiasm for what she did, and he respected her and just brought archaeology into kind of this golden age. So he said some really nice things about her, and
That's
I had
very
been,
kind.
it was very kind of Israel. And I had been on City of David, just sometimes hanging around and whatever, and I ran into Eilat. She just would stand there and listen to what people were saying. You know, she didn't have airs or pretenses. And I went up to her, oh, this must have been 10 years ago, and said, what do you think you found here? And why can you say you found this? And she said, well, I know this is a big administrative center. And she says, we're still looking for material evidence. And I said, what are you looking for? And then the last time I saw her, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I said, what do you think this is? And she says, I know this is David's that this is David's palace. It's more than an administrative center. I said, what have you found? And then she went on to explain what you said about the bulle and just all the different material data that she'd found. But she said, you know, people don't agree with me, but I think the more we find, the more they'll come around to what I think this is. Just very gracious. So it's just really a big loss to see that she had passed away.
I agree. I'm saddened to hear that. There are a couple of things. Somebody asked a little bit earlier, what maybe it was Cindy, what I thought about the City of David excavations. And two of the most compelling things, yes, administrative center and the huge numbers of bulle that are coming out of there. This is a technical term for those of you that don't keep up a whole lot with archaeology, for a clay seal that has been a seal impression that seals a document closed and is to be opened only by the person to whom the document is addressed. Anyway, tons of those things, hundreds of them. Gabi Barkai has been involved in the discovery of them because a lot of that stuff is sent in bucket loads over to the Temple Mount Sifting Project, and they do it kind of concurrently with working through those 400 dump truck loads of stuff that were illegally excavated from underneath the Temple Mount by the Waqf. But two of the main reasons why I think that Mazar is correct is the huge megaliths that are that palace area is constructed with. This is not just some fly-by-night private home. This is a massive structure. It also, by the way, indicates contra Israel Finkelstein, any kind of a centralized government, because you have to have a centralized government to conscript workers or, you know, to pay workers, whatever, to put a building together made of those size stones. So the size of the stones is one. Another has to do with that that Phoenician capital that is in the Israel Museum that's on display there. It's way high up, but it's there. And it was found where it had rolled down into the Kidron Valley, and the normal, you know, like if you had a big snowball or whatever, and you rolled it down from the area of the quote palace to where that Phoenician capital was found, that's where it would have come from. And the Phoenician capitals, whether it ends up being on coins or on or in stone, those are architectural features, kind of decorative features that are strictly relegated to royalty. And that then, for me, those two things together, along with the bulle and the administrative center, tells me that there was something really important associated with royalty going on in that exact spot. So I think that Mazar is correct. You know, that whole Mazar family, Elat, Ami, Benjamin, these guys are mountains of people. You know, they're bigger than life. They have changed history.
Those Phoenician capitals, Chandler said, were stylized palm trees.
Nice. Chandler, what was his other name?
Chandler Collins.
Colin.
Chandler. He teaches at JUC, just taught the biblical geography class. And he's the academic dean. He also teaches the Jerusalem class. I took both of those. Phenomenal. So if anybody's still here and wants to take some amazing classes, they're fantastic.
I can vouch for that.
Yeah, Joe, you were in the class.
Yeah, wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, it's wonderful. Professor, maybe I can just ask you, with respect to the Davidic palace, where is scholarship? Is it like 80% is convinced that it is, or is it Because if I recall, I don't think Chandler was convinced that was the palace.
Yeah.
And, he's a very competent scholar. Well, where are people across the board with that, my brother? Do you have any idea what the percentage is of yay versus nay?
The sense that I get, and Joe, I wish I could say that I was better read in that area. You know what my area is, intertestamental studies, and I'm not like a professional or a formally trained archaeologist, but my sense is that the majority, again, you can't determine what's true by majority. I found that historically, more often the majority is wrong. So I'd rather be in the minority, and that would give me a better chance of being correct. But I think in this case that the majority is leaning in the direction of Mazar. Lynn, do you have a better feel for the field, or?
I don't, but she wasn't uncomfortable with opposition. She just said, the more we find, the more that we can support. And I looked at Times of Israel and I looked at Jerusalem Post, and they did actually mention that more archaeologists were coming over to what she had projected. More and more are starting to see that the data supports what she thought was there. So I think it's a growing thing over time. And of course, when you've got people on the other side, that's what makes it exciting and interesting, and you listen to both of them. But I think more and more, the material culture is so overwhelmingly positive. What else can you say? So I think time will tell that, I think more will come to a Lot's perspective.
I have a feeling you're right. Hey, how about if we fold this thing up and go to bed?
So soon?
For those of you who are in Oregon, you can wait another couple of hours if you like. It's totally up to you.
Yeah. Thank you for giving us all this extra time, my brother.
Hey, I wish you guys Godspeed and all of his best blessings, and can't wait to be with you again next week. It's going to be, we're going to have some fun finishing this up.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Nunnally.
Good night, guys. Blessings
Thank
to you
you.
all.
Good night.
Lila Tov. Bye.
Tov lachem.
God bless you.
להתראות.
Thank you so much.
להתראות.